Hello, everyone. I think we are about ready to kick off. So I'm hoping everyone can hear me okay. I'm going to assume if there's complete silence that you can. I hope everyone's got teas and coffees in hand. Maybe even some dinner that I can see as well. It's great to see. So my name's Simon. I'm the chairperson of the Vitiligo Society. I can honestly say that this is a very strange time, and it's the first time that I've ever presented in slippers. So it's nice to be comfy, I suppose. Thank you for being here and donating via the ticket purchase that you've made to be on tonight's summit. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the first ever virtual summit that we've done as a charity, as the Vitiligo Society. And I'm very delighted to be hosting some fantastic leaders in the vitiligo field as well. On the call, we have both members and non-members. So for those that aren't familiar with the Society, and this is your first time interacting with us, we're a UK-based charity that supports people with vitiligo all over the world. We've been around for about 35 years, so we've got this amazing heritage as an organisation. We provide information, support and education on vitiligo, and we engage with the medical profession on research and treatments as well. So we're involved in all aspects of vitiligo around in the UK and around the world. Our primary form of income to support our mission is memberships. So thank you to all that are members and your continued support of us as an organisation. If you currently aren't a member and you enjoy this event and you'd like to become a member, please consider joining us so that we continue to do the important work that we do. And you'll get a host of other benefits as well by becoming a member. You can find out those benefits and sign up by visiting join.vitiligosociety.org. So it's join.vitiligosociety.org. So hopefully in front of you, you should be able to see the running order for this evening's summit. Just a bit of housekeeping before we kick off properly. Feel free to put your camera on so we can see all the beautiful faces that in attendance. But we do ask that you remain muted during the event, just to ensure that everyone can hear the speakers and have a good experience. I'm sure if you're used to using Zoom, you may be hearing kettles and vacuums and dogs barking in the background. So just keeping yourself on mute just helps everyone have a great experience. This summit is being recorded and it will be sent out to the ticket holders in the next couple of days. So if we'd love you to stay to the end, but if for any chance you can't, then we will send it on to you so you'll be able to watch it back. After each speaker talks, there will be some time for some question and answers. Natalie Ambersley, who is our social media and community lead, will be kindly moderating the questions that come in for the speakers. We sent out a form prior to the event asking for any questions, and we've already received some really fantastic ones that we'll put forward. But if you have something that comes to mind during the talks that you'd like to ask, please pop it in the Zoom chat box, which I believe should be to your right. And Natalie will be monitoring that, and she'll add it to the list of things to ask the speakers. If you have any other issues during the event, so anything with your audio or your video, please put it in the chat box as well, and we'll try and do our best to help. So before I introduce our amazing first speaker, I just wanted to take a moment to share something. So I personally get the privilege of meeting a lot of people with vitiligo. Some of them have just been diagnosed, and some that have been living with the condition for many years. And I often take the opportunity to share an analogy with them that I'd like to share with you right now. The analogy is the one of the hero's journey that comes from Greek mythology and how it relates to actually living with vitiligo. The hero's journey is where one seemingly ordinary person has a dramatic event in their life and is forced to go on a quest. The quest can often be extremely tough, with the person falling into despair and feeling like they will never overcome their personal obstacle to reach their goal. At this lowest point, the person finds this previously unknown strength from the depths of their being and is able to continue the path and find some type of success, freedom, or love. And I often draw this parallel with vitiligo, because being diagnosed with vitiligo can radically change a person's life. and it often forces you down the path of the hero's journey. You know, living with the condition can be incredibly tough and testing at times, and moving through this challenge and learning to love yourself makes you far stronger and a more resilient human being. So although it sounds just, you know, a bit cliched sometimes, I think it's so true that you know, having vitiligo forces this level of introspection to sort of understand yourself and learn to accept the condition. So you know, I'm witnessing more and more that in mainstream media and those on social media are choosing not to wear camouflage and to love the skin they're in and live their best life. It's very inspiring seeing these people now that have vitiligo accepting the condition more and learning to love themselves. And of course, as an organisation, we support this wholeheartedly, but it hasn't changed our founding mission as a charity. You know, we are still dedicated to supporting those living with vitiligo and working with different research parties to find effective treatments. And hopefully in the future, we all want a cure. So, you know, we still keep our hopes up for that. So I'm going to stop rambling very, very shortly and introduce our first speaker, Dr. John Harris. So Dr. Harris is the chair of Dermatology and director of the Vitiligo Clinic and Research Center at UMass Medical School in Worcester, Massachusetts. He is a dermatologist and a physician scientist caring for patients in a vitiligo specialty clinic and running a large research laboratory focused on understanding disease, pathogenesis, and developing new treatments. His group integrates multiple research strategies to accomplish this. As a result, early clinical trials in vitiligo have shown success and more are being developed. Finally, Dr. Harris founded Villaris Therapeutics, whose entire focus is to develop an effective, long-lasting treatment for vitiligo. Dr. Harris is recognized as one of the primary global thought leaders in vitiligo, and I'm delighted that he's been willing to speak for us today. So John, I'm happy to hand over to you now, sir. If I'll stop sharing my screen and hopefully you should be able to share yours.
Yep, happy to be here. Thanks everybody for coming to listen. It says the host disabled screen sharing, so you're gonna have to make me a co-host or something.
Try now.
Yep, that works.
Perfect.
So it's nice to meet you all virtually. I'm actually doing a lot of these lately, and it's been really very straightforward and easy to connect with people all over the world. So it's a really great new platform and way to talk to people and meet people and talk about vitiligo. So I'm taking advantage. I'm definitely using this platform and lots of Zoom meetings and in order to educate people about vitiligo. And so Simon asked me initially to talk about vitiligo and really what is it, first of all, a lot of questions, and then what are we doing now, and then where are we going? There are a lot of exciting new opportunities coming up, I think, in the near future for vitiligo, and that's where a lot of excitement comes. But I think it is definitely important to talk about what we have now, because I have one clinic a week. It's all vitiligo patients, and often I'm the fifth or sixth dermatologist that they've seen, and they said that they came to see me because all the other dermatologists told them there was nothing to do for vitiligo, which is just not true. So we're trying to change that and make sure people are getting the treatments that they want and need. So I'll start with what is it? So I'll even start about just what causes skin pigment. So the color in your skin comes from what are called melanosomes. These are little packets of pigment that are produced by a cell type called melanocytes. And those little packets of pigments are passed on to the surrounding cells called keratinocytes. And this is just an illustration of this. This is the melanocyte. You can see it looks like a tree really arborizing and having all these little feet and arms spread all over. And then the other cells here are called keratinocytes. And these are the bricks in the brick wall, in analogy, that make up the outer layer of your skin. So the melanocytes sit here and they make these little packets of pigment that are, you can see here, these little dots. And then they put them into the surrounding cells that make up this brick wall. And the cells then take this pigment up and they use the pigment to cover their nucleus where the DNA lives in these cells in order to protect themselves from the sunlight. And so the nucleus is where the DNA can be mutated and cause cancers and things. And so this pigment is able to create a barrier for the light. And there's about 1 melanocyte to 36 keratinocytes that surround it. And so this is the process of skin pigmentation. This is how things normally work. And then a lot of people like to know, really what causes skin color. So you can imagine if you have darker skin, you might have more of those melanocytes, and lighter skin, might have fewer of them. And that turns out not to be the case. So really everybody with all skin colors have about the same number of melanocytes in their skin. But the type and shape of melanin that they produce is different. So if you have very dark skin, you tend to have more football-shaped melanosomes that are darker in color. And then if you're very light skinned, you tend to have more baseball shaped melanosomes that are lighter in color, and fewer have the darker color. And there's every variant in between. So you can imagine, because there's so many different skin colors, it's a variation on the shape of the melanosome as well as how darkly colored it is. And this is what causes skin color. So then what causes vitiligo? If this is the skin, and these are the bricks I told you about, these are the keratinocytes that have all the melanin taken up, and these are the melanocytes that make the melanin. Deeper in the skin, you have blood vessels, and the blood vessels and fat, much deeper, but the blood vessels are how immune cells enter the skin in order to protect you from things. So if you get a viral infection, the immune cells will come in and clear the virus or the bacteria, and that's just kind of how the cells traffic in. So it turns out, if you have vitiligo, that there's a population of your immune cells that actually will recognize the melanocytes and think it's foreign and think it's a problem. So they might be fooled into thinking your normal pigment cells are either infected by a virus, or that they may have become a cancer, and the immune cells are trying to protect you from that cell. So they'll actually crawl into the skin and find those pigment cells, and then they'll kill them. And now, when you don't have the pigment cells producing pigment anymore, the keratinocytes, or the cells around them, lose their pigment and they turn white. So that's kind of what you see here. So this is an area where all the pigment cells have been destroyed up in the epidermis. However, you can see that there's a bunch of hairs growing in this spot as well, and the hairs actually have normal pigment, normal color. So these are dark hairs. And this is the reason why. So you've got a hair growing. This whole area now has been, all the melanocytes have been destroyed, and you have white skin. But the pigment cells actually still live within that hair follicle. And they are stem cells that can repigment the skin. And for some reason that we don't understand, these cells are protected in many cases from vitiligo. So there's the hair follicle is thought to be like a little fortress that keeps the immune system out. And so these cells are often able to survive. So what happens when we treat the vitiligo and we get rid of the autoimmune attack, those cells grow out of the hair follicle. They actually climb up the hair follicle and back into the skin surrounding the hair follicle. And they are able to bring pigment back to the skin, as you can see here. So they start working again, and then the pigment comes back. And this is why we often see these little brown dots when the skin has been treated. You see these little brown dots. Each one is around a hair follicle, and that's because the melanocytes have crawled out. And then these cells can continue to crawl, and they'll crawl and run into other cells coming out of other hair follicles until this spot is completely better. So how do we do this? That's how vitiligo occurs. That's why treatments work. And the question is, what treatments do we use? So just a quick slide to show you this. I want to leave a lot of time at the end for questions, but this is generally how I approach vitiligo, and it's this algorithm. So I start with asking the patient if their disease is active. And to me, active disease means they've got new spots appearing pretty quickly, which might mean that you've seen, a new spot in the past few months. Or sometimes it's been in the past week that they saw new spots popping up, and that means that it's really active. If you haven't seen spots in new spots in a while, it could mean that the vitiligo is there and it's what we call stable or inactive. It's just kind of sitting there. It's not getting better, but it's also not getting worse. If somebody is really active and their vitiligo is spreading really fast, I like to put them on a pill. Oral steroid pill. I usually use something called dexamethasone, and it's a very potent, low dose steroid. We often use steroids for lots of things in vitiligo, in dermatology and other fields, but But the steroids, the job here, we use a very low dose, is to just prevent the vitiligo from spreading. It actually doesn't tend to make the vitiligo better and make the pigment come back, but it's an early quick fix that we can put somebody on to prevent the vitiligo from getting worse while we're getting other treatments started. So the first thing we do is, if it's active, we have somebody take oral steroids. If it's not active, or once we've given them the steroids, we look to see how much vitiligo they have. And if they only have a very few spots and it's pretty easy to treat with a cream, we'll give them creams. And the creams, we usually give two different creams. One is a steroid and one is a non-steroidal called tacrolimus. And we have you use it twice a day on your spots for a week. And then you switch to the other one twice a day for a week, and then back and forth, and kind of use these back and forth. If you just have a few spots, you can use something called excimer laser, which is a laser, single wavelength of light that makes vitiligo better. And then if you have vitiligo that's very stable, you can consider actually transplant surgery. So you can go and take a piece of skin from another part of your body and put that on your vitiligo skin, and this can often make things better as well. If you have more than a few spots, though, it can be very hard to treat with just a cream. And so I really like to get patients onto narrowband UVB phototherapy as soon as possible when that's the case. Or if they're active, we immediately start this. And so this is a treatment actually that's been used for thousands of years for vitiligo, interestingly, because the sun, it comes from the sun, and people have used the sun for a very long time to treat vitiligo. So narrowband UVB, now we have special bulbs that don't give you the entire sun's rays, but just a fraction of their rays. And that's what's called narrowband UVB. The sun gives you visible light, UVA and UVB. And so this is just a fraction of what the sun gives you. It's just what vitiligo responds to. So when we give patients this, we may also give them creams to add on to that. And if they want, they can use both, and they use just the light and the creams together. Or if they don't like to use creams, they can use the light alone. So this is generally what we do currently for vitiligo, and patients get great responses with this therapy. It's probably important to note that there are some parts of the body that do not respond with vitiligo. And some of them are pretty visible and make patients upset. But the fingertips, the hands generally don't respond very well, whereas the face responds the fastest anywhere. So the face is the easiest to bring the pigment back. And the reason is because any part of skin that has a lot of hair follicles, for the reason we just talked about, if there's a lot of hair follicles there, the skin responds very quickly. And if there are no hair follicles, the skin does not respond. And that's like the hands, the feet. The underside of the wrists actually is another place. Okay, so that's what we're doing. And the question is, where are we going? So I'll show you actually some of the research that's been done that's leading to new treatments for vitiligo. This is a patient who came in to see me, as you can see, really with widespread vitiligo. And for different reasons, he had also received a kidney transplant. So he was on lots of oral medicines to suppress his immune system so that he didn't reject his kidney. And you can see here how much pigment came back. And this actually happened in a really short period of time, telling us that the immunosuppressants, or those drugs that suppress the immune system, can be very effective for treating vitiligo. But the problem is those drugs are very potent with lots of side effects. You know, if they suppress your immune system, there's potential to make infections worse and other things. And so we really can't do this for vitiligo patients for their vitiligo. But it actually gave us an idea that a focused treatment, so instead of turning off the entire immune system, maybe we can just turn off a piece of the immune system responsible for causing vitiligo. And that might actually be both better and safer. And so that's been our approach ever since we saw this and thought of this. So our strategy in my lab at UMass Medical School is really to use a lot of different tools to understand vitiligo and put them together so that we understand, vitiligo fully and in depth. And the tools that we use are clinical trials and observations in patients in the clinic, where we really start with people, humans, and we learn a lot about their disease. We also use mice that we can that get vitiligo. We can kind of give them vitiligo. You can see spots on the tail and the foot. And so we use the mice to understand a little bit more in depth what causes vitiligo, things that we can't understand just from studying humans. And then to tie everything together, we use skin and blood from patients with vitiligo, and we analyze this very much in depth. And this is the nice transition state, or it's a nice connection between the basic research that we do in mice and the clinical research that we do in humans. And we use all of these aspects to really understand vitiligo. And our goal is always to really develop new treatments for the disease. So research over the past 15 to 20 years by Richard Spritz and a few other people have really identified the genes that are responsible for vitiligo. So people ask me all the time, well, is genetics responsible? Does this run in families? And the answer is yes, to an extent. And there have been over 50 genes now actually 88 that have been implicated as playing a role in causing vitiligo. So there are a lot of genes that kind of all work together that decide whether you'll get vitiligo or not. And when you look at those genes, it tells you a little bit about what causes vitiligo, right? So if you know what those genes do, it gives you a hint as to what causes vitiligo. And the majority of those genes actually regulate your immune system. Those genes influence how strong your immune system is. And many of those genes are actually shared with other autoimmune diseases as well, like type 1 diabetes and thyroid disease and B12 deficiency. Those are all autoimmune diseases that are shared with vitiligo. So the more of these genes that you have, the more likely you are to get vitiligo, but also other autoimmune diseases. And this is why a lot of times in families, I'll see one person with vitiligo, but a family member with thyroid disease and another family member with diabetes, and there are lots of these that run through the family. But the fact that most of the genes are found in the immune system really tells us that vitiligo must be caused by the immune system. We do see that some of these genes are also in melanocytes themselves. And so, you can conclude that vitiligo is a conversation between the immune system and the melanocyte. And we know that well, let me just show you the next slide. And I'll tell you what that conversation's about. So Caroline LaPoule, many have heard of her. She's been doing research since the 90s now for almost 30 years now. And she early showed that biopsies from vitiligo skin showed that if you look at the cells that are going into those areas, in blue or black here are the melanocytes. And then the brown cells are stained with a special antibody to tell us that they're T cells. So we see melanocytes and T cells in little groups in vitiligo skin. This tells us that T cells are there while melanocytes are dying. Other studies actually showed what type of T cell those are. We have lots of different T cells, similar to the military. You might have a Navy and an Air Force and the Marines. Those are all part of the military, but they actually do different things for different purposes. So the CD8 T cells are the part of the military, the immune system, that appears to be responsible for attacking the melanocytes that are dying. We have some background noise there. Perfect. Thank you, Brendan. And so later studies, almost 25 years later, showed that if you take skin from this patient and pull out immune cells from that skin, specifically the CD8 T cells we observed over here, and culture those cells with normal skin from that same patient, those cells will crawl into the skin and kill the melanocytes, causing vitiligo. So this is a really good, really nice study, and it really indicates that these CD8 T cells, these cells here, are the ones that are causing this disease, that are killing the melanocytes. So based on that, starting with that, we actually created a mouse model, so a way to give the mice vitiligo so that we could understand at a deeper level how this disease works. And we do that by giving the mice with black skin and black hair, CD8 T cells that attack melanocytes. So we're able to get these cells from a different mouse and put them into a mouse that has black skin. And over time, we can see that the mice have white spots that are appearing here on the tail, on the foot, on the nose, and the ear. And so the mice get white spots just like vitiligo. And we can use that to understand what causes it. I'm noticing actually that I have a couple lines on my screen. I don't know, Simon, if you have drawing capabilities, but if you can erase those, I didn't draw them.
Okay.
Maybe they're just, I don't know where.
I'll try and remove them.
Yeah, if you can. Otherwise, it's not a big deal. All right. So the first thing we did was to take skin from the mice with vitiligo and patients with vitiligo. As I mentioned, that's one of the things that we do. We use the mice and we use patients. And when we looked at the skin, we looked at what genes are turned on. And this is really kind of giving us an indication what might be causing the vitiligo. If we can see, you have about 30,000 genes in your body and every cell has all these genes. If you can look at which ones are getting turned on, you might get a hint as to what we can block, which ones we can turn back off in order to treat vitiligo. So the details here aren't that important, but these are genes that are expressed by melanocytes that cause pigment production. And you can see that those genes are disappearing from the skin in vitiligo. And this is, you'd expect that because the melanocytes are getting killed. But the other genes that are turned on are what we call interferon gamma induced genes. This is a protein or a gene that's turned on, and this gene actually turns all these other genes on. So when you see all this little cluster of genes getting turned on, it really gives you an indication of what causes vitiligo. And this is really helpful because there are other genes. Remember the analogy of the military. If this is the Army, this is the Navy, and this is the Air Force over here. And what's important is we have very good drugs that treat diseases over here in 17 type inflammation. And we have very good drugs that treat diseases over in 2 type inflammation, but not here in the 1 type inflammation. So we can treat the Navy, we can treat the Air Force, we can't treat the Army right now. We don't have drugs for this. Or as of a few years ago, we didn't. And in fact, when we use these drugs for different diseases, they actually cause vitiligo in many cases. So some people can get vitiligo by using these drugs. So then based on that data, we thought that interferon gamma might be a cause of vitiligo. That's what we would call a hypothesis beginning in the lab. So we did a lot of studies, we published a lot of papers, and we found that our mouse model the mice that we're using don't get vitiligo if you can block interferon gamma signaling, if you can turn off this pathway. And interferon gamma, I don't know if you noticed back here, interferon gamma, CXCL10 is another protein, another gene that's turned on, and it's probably the highest expressed protein in the whole skin when you have vitiligo. So we wanted to find that interferon gamma is required for mice to get vitiligo, and then we also found that CXCL10, which is turned on by interferon gamma, is also required for mice to get vitiligo. And even more exciting, while we were able to prevent vitiligo by using mice that didn't have CXCL10, we could use an antibody against CXCL10 and actually reverse the disease. So this is a mouse that used to have a black tail. Now it's got a white tail from vitiligo. And then when we just treat these mice with an antibody against CXCL10, we can see all the pigments start coming back. And this is the perifollicular repigmentation. They're coming back from the hair follicles, just like we see in humans. So we're very excited about this. And so this is a quick summary of of that interferon gamma pathway. It starts with interferon gamma, signals through a receptor called interferon gamma receptor. It also signals through proteins called JAK1 and 2. That might sound familiar to you because we have JAK inhibitors to treat skin diseases. That activates another protein called STAT1, which results in the release of these proteins called CXCL9 and 10 that signal through their receptor CXCR3. So I know a lot of letters and numbers and can be confusing, but this is how interferon gamma works to signal through this pathway to bring in the T cells to make disease worse. And so we were able to find using our mouse that because we can get mice that can't make interferon gamma, we can get mice that don't have the interferon gamma receptor or can't make chemokines. Any of those mice actually don't get vitiligo when we try to give it to them. So we know that this is a very important pathway in driving the disease. In addition, we can use antibodies against some of these pieces of the pathway, not only to prevent disease, but we can actually reverse it in the mice. And I showed you that example with the CXCL10 antibody previously. And then, of course, as you may have guessed, JAK inhibitors are able to shut off this process as well. And we found that JAK inhibitors work well in our mice to both prevent and reverse vitiligo. But maybe more importantly than the fact that we can treat our mice is that we can treat people with JAK inhibitors. So this is one of the earliest studies that was done. This is one of a few. Another was Brett King and David Rosemarin followed up as well. But we gave this patient an oral drug called ruxolitinib. This is a JAK inhibitor that blocks these 2 JAKs, JAK1 and 2. So this is a small molecule that prevents these proteins from getting activated and working. And so when we gave the patient oral ruxolitinib, this is how his face looked to begin. And I've outlined just the pigmented areas on his face. And then after treatment, you can see that most of his pigment came back in just a few months. And we had also looked in his blood and we could find that same protein, CXCL10, downstream of interferon gamma. We could see that protein was up in his blood for over a year. And as soon as he started the drug, that protein dropped. And so this told us that not only was JAK inhibitor ruxolitinib effective for vitiligo, it worked for vitiligo, but it seemed to be working the way we'd hypothesized back here by blocking interferon gamma signaling and causing a reduction here. So based on this and those other studies I talked about, A number of pharmaceutical companies have launched clinical trials now to treat vitiligo, and a lot of companies have different JAK inhibitors, different versions of the JAK inhibitor. And so these are all JAK inhibitor trials that have been started. Aclaris did a topical study, Incyte also did a topical study, Dermavant a topical, and Pfizer actually has an oral JAK inhibitor that they're working on. And I like to show pictures of the people in the lab who helped with the research. This is Zenny and this is Mehdi. And I'll tell you about the results of the Incyte clinical trial because we published that just a couple months ago. So this is how the trial was set up. Essentially, we enrolled 157 patients with vitiligo, and then they were randomized to 5 different groups. One got vehicle control, or what we would call placebo, and the other 4 groups were just different doses of the drug. At the end of 6 months, the people who were randomized to vehicle were re-randomized to a higher dose of drug. So eventually everybody got put on the drug. And then after a year, everybody was put on the highest dose of drug. So this is overall a 2-year study. And we saw really nice results. So what I'm showing you here is the percent of the study members that got at least 50% improvement of their vitiligo on their face. So that's example here. If this is vitiligo, this would be 50% improvement. And the F stands for facial. Remember, I told you the face was the easiest part to treat. So this is kind of the first thing we looked at just to see if the drug was doing anything. And so this is 50% improvement of vitiligo on the face. You can see that after just 6 months, about half of patients were able to get this at the highest doses of drug. This was pretty similar even after a year. And the placebo rate, which is interesting, is very low. So these are the patients that got placebo. There might have been a 3% response, then 0, then 3. So very low placebo rate in vitiligo. And then all the drugs did something, but the highest doses seemed to do the most. And then if you look at the T-VASI 50, also 50% improvement, but now it's for the total body and not just the face. The results are a little bit lower, but still pretty good. So 45% of the subjects using the highest dose got at least 50% better on the body, which is good. The body is harder to treat than the face. When we use a bit of a higher bar and we say, well, we want 75% improvement instead of just 50 on the face, we can see that half the patients actually got there after a year on the highest dose of drug. And when we raise it even higher and say we want 90% improvement, a third of the patients on the face got that. So this is actually a really good response. This is an example. I really like this picture as an example because this woman actually was randomized to placebo. She was on vehicle just for the first 6 months, so no drug. And you can see she didn't get any better. And she actually got a little bit worse. You can see the pigment around her eyes actually even further went away. But remember, at 6 months, she was given a high dose of drug, and then 6 months later, she had almost all of her pigment back. So this is just a really nice example of the response. And I mentioned you can see this on the body, not just the face. So here's an elbow before and after 6 months of treatment. So a nice response there. And then a lot of times say, well, what are the side effects? And the only side effect that we observed with the drug that was higher in the drug that compared to the placebo was acne in the area where the drug was applied. So when you put the cream on, about 10 to 15% of the patients who used it in that area of application got acne. Now, this acne went away when they stopped applying the cream, and this didn't really bother anybody enough to leave the trial. So people were still pretty happy with the results. And then all these other side effects that were reported, like itch, infections of the lungs, and headache, and all these things, were just as common in the placebo as the drug. So this really tells us that this had nothing to do with the drug. And we all get headaches and things. So and we get itchy skin too. So this is common. So that's really exciting. I think we have that will probably become FDA approved. We're hoping in the US in the next couple years so that we can start prescribing that medicine. We can use it off-label even now. So off-label means the medicine can be produced and made, and I can still prescribe it for patients, but it's not made by any company or sold by a company, and usually the insurance won't cover it. So I like to show this picture just to highlight the fact that JAK inhibitors are not what we would call durable. So this patient stopped his treatment at week 20, and then just 3 months later, he had lost almost all of his pigment again. So that's kind of disappointing that this drug doesn't last a long time after it's stopped. But we know that's the case for all the treatments we use for vitiligo right now. This is my friend Thierry Passeron in France. Sorry, my dog is barking. Thierry did this study where he took a bunch of patients and put them on all kinds of treatments for vitiligo and made them all better. But then he stopped their treatment and looked to see what happened over the next year. And he found that about 40% of patients who'd gotten better with their vitiligo, 40% the vitiligo came back within a year of stopping. And he also reported that if you use a cream just twice per week called tacrolimus or Protopic, if you put the cream on twice a week, you could decrease this relapse rate to under 10%. So this is kind of the purpose of this study. But it also indicates the fact that relapse is pretty common in vitiligo. And not only does vitiligo come back, but it comes back in the exact same spots you had before. So if you had a spot on your left forearm and it relapses, it's going to come back on your left forearm first. And this really tells us that somehow those vitiligo spots have some memory, right? If you can make them better and they know exactly where to return to, there must be some memory there kind of creating that spot. So we and three other labs actually from all over the world, Julian Seneschal is in France, Mary Jo Turk is here in Vermont, New Hampshire. And Liv Eidsmo is in Stockholm, Sweden. So 4 different groups all kind of studied this phenomenon. Why does the vitiligo come back? How does it know to come back in the same spot? And we found that those CD8 T cells that I told you about before, when they get into the skin, they actually form resident memory, which means they get a lot of sticky proteins on their surface and they glue themselves into the epidermis and they never leave. And so they kind of stick there, and that's why the memory forms. Those T cells kind of stay there, and when those melanocytes try to regrow from the hair follicle, like I mentioned before, they're immediately seen by those T cells that are sitting there and killed again. And so it's those cells that are responsible for the maintenance, for continue having the white spots in your skin even when they're not spreading. And these cells are important because they form to protect you from viruses. So they're not there to protect you from to give you vitiligo. They're there to get rid of viruses and make sure that if the virus ever comes back, it can be treated quickly. So this is just a picture of that, what I just told you. I mentioned that the CD8 T cell, you saw pictures of that engaging with the melanocyte here, finding it. And when that happens, they make interferon gamma. And that interferon gamma causes the surrounding keratinocytes to make CXCL10 that brings in more cells into the skin. And so this is this constant cycle. Now these cells will make interferon gamma and do the whole process again, and more cells will come in, and you get this, what we would call a positive feedback loop. This just keeps going and going and going and getting amplified where there's more cells, killing more melanocytes, and this is what causes vitiligo. At the same time, these cells, like I said, when they get up here, they convert into what we call resident memory T cells, or TRM, that are glued into the epidermis, into the skin. And when these melanocytes try to come out, they engage and they get killed because these cells then turn on interferon gamma, which turns on more CXCL10, which brings in more cells to kill these cells. And when you take treatments, whether it's JAK inhibitors or even the conventional treatments we were talking about, steroids, Protopic, light therapy, we know that these can actually shut these cells off and stop them from working, which is why the melanocytes then are allowed to regrow and pigment the skin. But the problem is when you stop these treatments, the resident memory T cells are still there and they wake back up and they start the whole process over again. And we showed that that was the case with JAK inhibitors here in our mouse model. So we took mice with vitiligo, gave them either vehicle control or we gave them JAK inhibitors, and we saw that the mice got a lot better. But we did not see the resident memory T cells go down in number at all. They were still there, as you can see here, regardless of the treatment. Even though the mice got better, the cells are still there. So this is why how vitiligo, what we would say, progresses or continues when it's active and spreads. And then this is the reason for the maintenance and the relapse of vitiligo over here. So we came up with an idea that maybe we could target the resident memory T cells. If we could find a way to not just put them to sleep, but to actually remove them from the skin, then we would have a great treatment for vitiligo, and maybe we'd be able to stop that treatment and the disease wouldn't relapse, it wouldn't come back. So long story short, over many years of research trying to figure this out, we found that the resident memory T cells require a different protein called IL-15. And when we use an antibody that blocks the receptor for IL-15, it prevents IL-15 from feeding the resident memory T cells and keeping them in the skin. And we can see that when we do that, when we block IL-15, the pigment came back in the mice really nicely, as you can see here in the tail. And more importantly, the resident memory T cells then disappeared from the skin. So this is why blocking IL-15 is different from JAK inhibitors. We think that once you get these guys out of the skin, then the vitiligo won't come back, or it'll take a really long time for it to come back. So based on this, there are new clinical trials and studies that are being done. So this is a kind of complicated figure about IL-15 signaling. So this is a keratinocyte. This is a T cell. IL-15 is held out by the keratinocyte by its hand here, and the T cell can see that through its receptor. So there's a number of ways that you can interfere with this process. You could use an antibody against IL-15 that binds here and prevents the T cell from seeing it. Or you could use an antibody against the receptor here that also prevents the T cell from seeing it. Now, there's a company named Amgen who created an antibody against IL-15 already, and they've tested it in clinical trials for celiac disease. And so this antibody is actually being used now in a clinical trial that's going to start in any day now here in the United States to test this hypothesis that we created. Now, I was supposed to run this trial, but I had to recuse myself from the trial because I received funding to start my own company to make a better drug that we think. So it's called Valeris Therapeutics. I'm the founder of the company. We're able to get venture capital, Series A funding to start a company, and we're making an antibody against the receptor for IL-15. For a number of different reasons, we think that this is going to work a lot better than this, but we'll have to see. So this is the summary. I've already shown you this figure. You could treat vitiligo by blocking with JAK inhibitors or using antibodies against the cytokines that we talked about here. You could treat vitiligo by blocking IL-15 and getting rid of the resident memory, which we think will last a lot longer. So I thought I'd just kind of tell you, you've probably heard about a couple of the other things. This is not our research, but just a couple of slides showing you what other people are doing. There's always been this question about how these T cells kill melanocytes. You know, how does this happen? How do they do it? It might give us some new ideas for new treatments. So Julian Seneschal and his collaborators did this study in France where they looked and they could see, you know, in normal skin, you can see the red cells here are stained so that you can see them. The red cells are the melanocytes, and they're supposed to sit at the bottom of the epidermis that I was telling you before, the upper layer of the skin. But in vitiligo, they seem to be floating away. This is where they're supposed to be anchored down here. They seem to be just kind of disappearing higher up where they're not supposed to be. And so it really looked at like the melanocytes that are supposed to hold on in the skin were letting go and kind of disappearing. And we didn't know why this was. And a recent paper by their group really suggested that it's proteins or cytokines produced by the T cells actually make this happen. So I remember I said the T cell gets up to the melanocyte, starts dumping all these cytokines on top of it, and that may cause it to release and separate and disappear. And so this may be one way that melanocytes are dying. And you could imagine if you could interfere with this process, it might be another treatment for vitiligo. And then many have heard about Caroline Lapoule's work, and she talks about HSP70I. So HSP stands for heat shock protein. It was first discovered when cells in a dish were heated up really hot, or when if you get a skin sunburn or something burns, these proteins get made in order to protect your cells. But they're also can be pretty inflammatory. So these proteins, usually when a cell makes a protein like this, it's getting too hot, or a lot of other things can do it too. It usually indicates the cell might be injured, and it might need the immune system to come in and remove it. So anyway, what she found was if you take this protein, HSP70, and you inject it into mice along with melanocyte proteins as well, the mice get vitiligo. And so this mouse, the immune system kind of starts to recognize the melanocyte proteins. And then if they get HSP70, it makes them really angry. And that's where you get vitiligo. And then she also showed that if you take a mouse that can't make HSP70, they're called knockout mice. Essentially, these are normal in every other way, except they can't make HSP70 protein. They're somewhat protected from vitiligo. So you can try to give them vitiligo, but they have less of it. And so then finally, she also showed that if you take HSP70, this protein that's an alarm protein that seems to enhance inflammation in vitiligo, and you mutate it with just one amino acid, so you make it slightly different, then you can use it and maybe confuse the immune system into not causing vitiligo. And when you use this altered Q435A as just a mutated version of HSP70, in comparison to the non-mutated version, it looks like it might shut the immune system off. And so this is what she's working on in order to try to create a treatment for vitiligo. She actually tested this in pigs as well. This is called the Sinclair swine. This is a black pig that gets a melanoma and then gets vitiligo around it. And with the control, this, you can see that a white spot appears. And when they treated with this mutated HSP70, you can see the pigment coming back here. And so the hope is that this will actually reverse vitiligo as well. So this is just an illustration of that. This is a melanocyte. The melanocyte can be stressed by a lot of things. We didn't talk about this today, but hair dyes and other chemicals can induce vitiligo. We think that it really gets this cell stressed, and that causes release of HSP70, and then the immune system sees that and starts attacking. So I like to use this analogy kind of at the end because there's a lot of excitement around new treatments for vitiligo. And the first thing I showed you was we could probably make every vitiligo patient better if we just treat them as if they had a kidney transplant. So if we give them lots and lots of pills to suppress their immune system, they'll get better. But the problem is that's really analogous. If these are all lamps, right? And these are all beautiful lamps, except maybe for this one in the Christmas story, the leg lamp, the infamous leg lamp. If you want to just shut off this lamp, you certainly could do that by cutting the power to the house. So if you cut the entire power to the house, this lamp will go off. But the problem is all your other lamps will go off, and that's not ideal. And so if we were using kidney transplant drugs to treat vitiligo, this is what we'd be doing. And you might impair your viral defense and get parasites and bacteria and tumors. And this is something that you don't want. So you don't want to use heavy hitting drugs like that. But you can imagine as we get closer and closer and we learn more about vitiligo, which is the lamp we do want to turn off, we might get better. We might be able to spare virus defense, but we might still hit parasitic defense and bacteria. We might get better and then just hit kind of the end. But ideally what we want to do is we want to find out which of these switches we can turn off just to turn off vitiligo and leave the rest of your immune system intact. And so that's kind of our strategy and our approach right now, where we already know how to shut this off, but you wouldn't want that because it would be dangerous and you get lots of side effects. Our goal is to get closer and closer and closer to doing this. And this is what we're working on all the time. And you can imagine once we know enough to do this, we might be able to just cut this whole cord and stop vitiligo and keep everything intact, and that would be a cure. So I always like to show this slide because I get a lot of credit for the research that we're doing, but I don't actually do any of it. I'm involved with the ideas and looking at the data and figuring out what to do. But these are the guys that are actually working in the lab and doing the experiments and taking care of the mice and taking care of the patients with vitiligo in the clinical trials and doing all the studies and generating the data. And this is a fantastic group. And of course, we need money to do this. It's very expensive to do what we do. We're fortunate that the NIH in the US and the American Skin Association, the Dermatology Foundation have supported our work. And those are the slides I prepared for you today. I think we still have some time. I'd love to take some questions if we have that, Simon.
John, thank you so much for taking us all through that. It was really, really interesting to read and quite a positive outlook for the future. I'm going to hand over to Natalie now, if that's okay. Nat, for you to ask some of the questions that we've had through.
Yeah, sure. So thanks very much for that, John Harris. That was really, really insightful. So we've had some questions come through. I'm going to start with questions I have here on my spreadsheet, and then I'll come into the questions that are in the chat. So the first question is from a lady called Angela. I would like to ask if much research has been done on how many people with vitiligo also have thyroid problems, as two friends of hers have a thyroid problem as well.
Yeah, lots of research, lots of studies, and they all pretty much tell us the same thing, that thyroid disease is much more common in patients with vitiligo and their family members. So about 3% of the population in the world get thyroid disease. If you have vitiligo, your risk is actually 20%. So it's much higher, right? But still 20% is not that high. And so 80% of people with vitiligo have no thyroid problems at all, but they might have a family member with a thyroid issue. And the reason we think is because I mentioned in the beginning that the genes that cause vitiligo many of those genes also cause thyroid disease and type 1 diabetes and other things. So if you get vitiligo, you probably have some of those genes, and those can also cause other diseases.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from Salma, and she asks, I have recently heard about the successful use of JAK inhibitors in Europe in regards to the treatment of vitiligo. Could you explain in a little more detail how these work?
Yeah, so that's what we just did. The JAK inhibitors shut off part of the immune system that causes vitiligo. And so when you shut that off, those cells don't attack and kill your pigment cells anymore. And it allows the new cells to come back from the hair follicles. The problem is when you stop those JAK inhibitors, the whole process starts over again. And so you kind of have to continue to use them. But I mentioned very early in my slide, there are these three pieces. If you think of the immune system like three pieces, again, it might be the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army. We call the aspects 1, 2, and 17. And 1 is what causes vitiligo. The key is the JAK inhibitors. We never really had anything to shut off the 1. We had good drugs to shut off the 17 and the 2, and the JAK inhibitors were really our first real medication that shuts off that 1 pathway, and that's why they work for vitiligo.
Brilliant. The next question is in relation to COVID-19, and this is, where is it? Yeah. Has any research been carried out during the pandemic into the effects of COVID-19 on autoimmune diseases such as vitiligo?
Yeah, it's being done. I've got friends all over the world who are experts in vitiligo, and one of them in Amsterdam, Marcel Bekenk, is really interested in this question. And so he's kind of gotten everybody together, and we're all talking about, how to do this study and collecting data, and so we'll know more. It's still early to know how the virus affects vitiligo in a formal way. I can say informally, I've talked to a lot of people now, my own patients who have noticed during the pandemic their vitiligo has gotten worse, but not because they got COVID, but probably because just the pandemic is really a stressful time for everybody. I have seen patients with vitiligo get COVID, and their vitiligo didn't necessarily get active, but just the whole population during this time, stress does appear to make vitiligo worse. The other thing that's being studied is, do any of the treatments that we're giving patients with vitiligo, could that make COVID worse? That's the other way. If you're getting treated for vitiligo, should you be worried about catching COVID and maybe having bad outcomes? And that does not appear to be the case. Most of the treatments we're giving you are just on the surface of your body. They're not, internal and affecting your immune system inside, except maybe for the oral steroids that we talked about. If your vitiligo is really active, sometimes we'll give you pills to shut that down. That has been studied in other diseases, and it looks like those pills that we give for vitiligo do not make COVID worse at all, that people are having the same kind of response. Interestingly, kind of the last piece, people are studying JAK inhibitors actually as a treatment for patients who are having bad reactions to COVID. We don't think it makes it worse being on JAK inhibitors. It actually might make it better. And we don't have enough data now to know that for sure, but that's what we think.
Great. We've got a question from Sandra, and she asks, is there a link between vitiligo and vitamin D deficiency? Sandra was diagnosed at the age of 50, but then years later discovered that she was vitamin D deficient. Could this have triggered her outbreak?
No, good question. Lots of people ask that, and we thought maybe it was the case a number of years ago, because we looked at a lot of people with vitiligo and found that they were vitamin D deficient. So there's that would be what we'd call a correlation, right? Having vitiligo correlates with having low vitamin D. But it turns out that as we tested more and more people, we're pretty much all vitamin D deficient. And that might be partially our fault, because dermatologists tell you to stay out of the sun and it causes skin cancer, and that's where you get your vitamin D. So lots of people are vitamin D deficient. And studies have been done now to show that vitiligo patients aren't necessarily more vitamin D deficient than other people, unless they're doing a good job at staying out of the sun, which may be the case. But when you give vitamin D to vitiligo patients, they don't necessarily do better. So there doesn't appear to be a link there.
Right. We've got a question from Shika, and she asks, can people with vitiligo receive laser hair removal treatments? I've heard specialists won't treat vitiligo patients for this purpose because it makes the vitiligo worse.
So I get asked this question all the time, and I wish I had a better answer than I have. So the answer is there have been no studies looking at what happens to your vitiligo after hair removal. And because I don't have vitiligo, I don't have personal experience. I have been on Facebook, though. I'm a member of your group on Facebook. I kind of keep an eye on things to see what people are saying. And this question comes up there a lot. And so I'm hoping to learn the answer maybe from Facebook or wherever I can, because what it's going to take is a lot of people who have vitiligo and have done hair removal to tell us what happened after. I can tell you, from the science piece of it, what I would hypothesize potentially and what to look out for. So there are two reasons why hair removal might be bad for vitiligo. Number one, most hair removal is now done with a laser. And the reason that it works is because the laser goes into the pigmented hair follicle, the dark hair follicle, and that pigment absorbs the light to a point where it gets it really, really hot and it blows it apart. And that's why the hair falls out. And so you can imagine then if you're going in and you're exploding melanocytes in each hair follicle, that could make the immune system angry at melanocytes. It might be a bad situation where the immune system starts to attack melanocytes and gets really excited about them. And that's what vitiligo is. So that's one risk. I would suspect that probably wouldn't happen if your vitiligo isn't active. So if you've seen the spots and they have the same pattern, you've had that pattern for years, probably would be safe to do that. The second problem though with hair removal is, remember I told you that the pigment, when it comes back from the hair follicle. So if you don't have hair follicles, then the pigment can't come back. So if you do hair removal and then you get a spot of vitiligo, it might be actually really hard to get that pigment back and to reverse it. But all of that is just what I'm thinking, and nobody's done a study, and maybe we can source that question from large groups like yours.
Thank you. We've got a question from Daniel, and he asks, vitiligo seems to have different triggers in different people. Does this mean there will never be one cure for all?
I don't believe that. Yeah, it's a good question. You can imagine, if vitiligo is caused by A in one person and C in another person and X in another person, and you have a good drug that blocks C, then the people with A and X type vitiligo aren't going to get any better. I don't think that's the case, though. I think vitiligo, I think what I would call as a scientist, a final common pathway, where there's a lot of ways to feed in to what could trigger the vitiligo, but ultimately, all vitiligo is caused by this one final pathway that starts with interferon gamma and chemokines and CD8 T cells and killing. So if you remember that almost last slide that I showed, the melanocyte right in the middle, cellular stress within the melanocyte actually triggers autoimmunity and triggers inflammation. And there are different ways that cell can become stressed. It might be because, in some people, their genetics are so that they've got kind of a little bit wimpy melanocytes. And the melanocytes can't handle, working too hard. Or others, it might be because they actually put a chemical on their skin that goes into the melanocyte, and that stresses the melanocyte. Or others, it might be because they injured their skin and the melanocyte got injured from a cut or something. But ultimately, I think that all feeds into the final pathway. And the good news is I think we can just block that one pathway with treatments. And therefore, I do think that most vitiligo will respond. I'll say that with a caveat that there is one type of vitiligo, a subtype of vitiligo called segmental vitiligo. And you'll know you have it because it starts and then it evolves very quickly over about 6 months. And then it stops forever. And it only is on one side of your body. So it never goes to the other side. It's just on one side. If you have that type of vitiligo, that involves the hair really quickly. And so that's kind of a harder vitiligo to treat. So we kind of think of that as a little bit separate from the typical vitiligo. And we have some ideas about what causes that. But even that one, we think eventually requires interferon gamma and CD8 T cells, et cetera. Sorry, long answer, but that's something I'm currently thinking about.
Brilliant, thank you. And sorry, just going back to COVID again, Anthony asks, will there be any effect if we were to take the vaccine, the COVID vaccine? Would there be any effects with vitiligo?
Well, we don't know, because we haven't observed that. Again, I like to have data before I say anything about what we know. The job of the vaccine is to get your immune system, going and angry, so that you can recognize it in case the virus ever comes. And so if you get the immune system angry, you could imagine that it might also get angry at your pigment cells too, and things could get a little bit worse. I think that there's a very low risk of that happening. We'll find out if I'm right, but you get viruses all the time. If you have vitiligo for 10 years, imagine how many antiviral reactions your immune system just went through, in 10 years, probably 50 of them. I don't think that this vaccine is going to be any different than getting a bad virus, or maybe a mild virus even. And if those other viruses don't necessarily make your vitiligo worse, then this probably won't either. But we don't know for sure until we see and collect some data.
Brilliant. So I'm going to just go over to the questions in the chat. So I'm just going to read through them. So the first one is, what is your opinion on the Dead Sea treatment with sun therapy? And that's a question from Carol.
It works. And I can't tell you exactly why, but I even send some of my patients to the Dead Sea when I'm out of ideas. I talked about the treatments that I use, and that works in almost everybody. I have to say probably 95 to 98% of patients get better with those treatments. But when I find a couple that don't, and it flummoxes me, they're on narrowband UVB and they're using oral steroids and they're using topicals that I have, and maybe even topical JAK inhibitors. If none of those work, I really try to get them an oral JAK inhibitor, and that seems to always work, even for those tough patients. But if I can't get them the oral JAK inhibitor because it's really expensive and their insurance won't pay for it, I suggest or recommend that they go to the Dead Sea. And I've had 2 patients do this now, that went to the Dead Sea for 3 weeks and came back better. So there is something special there. I think what it is the elevation. So it's below sea level. And we know the sunlight makes vitiligo better because it gives you UVB. But it's what we think is happening is the sun has to travel through more atmosphere in order to hit you at the Dead Sea, that level. And somehow the right wavelengths of light out of the sun are scattered and the right ones reach the bottom and hit your skin. And it's just the right mix by chance or luck or whatever you think. I don't think if you, for example, had Dead Sea water in your bathtub and soaked in that and went out in our sunlight, that you would get the same effect. So I think it's more the location and the elevation there. Although certainly soaking in the Dead Sea also enhances penetration of the light. So that's kind of a lot of hand waving. We might actually go there someday and find out which wavelengths of sun actually are hitting the skin down there. Maybe we can create that in a booth. Long answer, but short answer is, yeah, it works.
Brilliant. So Carol and Merja Melza, and I apologize if I pronounced that incorrectly, have asked a similar question. So are there any negative effects on UVB narrowband treatment?
Well, it's just like the sunlight. If you get too much of it, you can burn your skin, and you can burn it pretty bad. So just like you can get a really bad sunburn, if you get too much, if you expose your skin for too long at the same time, that can happen if somebody makes a mistake and they think you're supposed to be at 2 minutes, but they misread it and they think it's 4 minutes and you stay in there for 4 minutes, your skin can get really badly burned. That right now is the biggest side effect or downside of getting narrowband UVB. So we know that the sun gives you skin cancer, and too much sun exposure will give you skin cancers, right? It turns out that after using narrowband UVB for 30 or more years, that the narrowband UVB does not give you skin cancer. UVA does. So if you go to a tanning booth, which is different, gives you UVA, not UVB. Tanning booths give you skin cancer. The sun gives you skin cancer, but it doesn't appear that narrowband UVB gives you skin cancer. So that's good. And there's a friend of mine in Korea, actually, who does studies. And he looked at a huge Korean database with millions and millions of people in it, just to ask the question, if you take a bunch of people who got a lot of UVB treatments, did they get skin cancer? And the answer was no. So he confirmed that. But the question is, did anything else bad happen to them? What did they get? High blood pressure? Or did they get, colon cancer? What did anything happen to them? And the only thing that he was able to find in that study was that people with long-term UVB treatments got less heart disease and fewer strokes. So I actually feel pretty good about narrowband UVB. I like using it. I really don't see a strong reason not to use it or worry too much about it. And then on top of all that, if you have vitiligo, your risk of skin cancer is lower than the general population. So I'm taking patients with a very low risk of skin cancer. I'm giving them a form of light that doesn't cause skin cancer, and if anything, might make their heart better. So I feel pretty good about it.
Brilliant. So Sarah asks, is there a positive link between arthritis and vitiligo? I heard of a drug which helped with vitiligo, but it was actually for arthritis.
Yeah, that's the JAK inhibitors. That's how we first found it. So tofacitinib or Xeljanz is a rheumatoid arthritis treatment. And so Brett King at Yale took that treatment and gave it to a patient with vitiligo to see if it might work, and it worked great. And so that's kind of how we discovered it. There aren't really close links between vitiligo and rheumatoid arthritis. Maybe a little bit. If you have vitiligo, you might be at a slightly higher risk of having rheumatoid arthritis, but it's not very high. There's not a strong link. But clearly they are driven by some of the same pathways because the same drug works for both.
Brilliant. So Rosie has asked, is the treatment the same no matter the root cause of the vitiligo, i.e. chemical reaction as opposed to genetic predisposition? Is there a way to tell how you got it? Is it common to be connected to alopecia?
Okay, 3 questions. It is connected to alopecia areata. So alopecia just means hair loss. You can have that through an autoimmune alopecia areata disease, or you can have that just because, you know, you're a man and you lose your hair as you get older. That's alopecia as well. But alopecia areata, there is a connection with vitiligo, number one. Is the treatment the same no matter what causes it? Well, if yes and no. If a chemical caused your vitiligo, the first thing to do is stop using that chemical. So that's the key. But after that, yeah, we use the same treatments to bring the color back and reverse it. And then there was a second question kind of stuffed in the middle of those two.
Is there a way to tell how you got it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So if you got it, I mean, not really, right? I mean, if you have lots of family members with vitiligo, then the genetic root was probably a big part of it. If you used a chemical, you used a hair dye, and then you got vitiligo right around it, or there's a patch called the methylphenidate patch that people use for ADD as a treatment. That patch is given vitiligo to about 50 people, and it was obvious because you put the patch on the right hip and then on the left hip the next day and back and forth, and the vitiligo just formed under those patches and then spread later on. So, if it's obvious like that a chemical you used caused it, then yes, but most of the time we don't know.
Great. So Leslie asks, as we get older and the immune system declines, should this affect vitiligo?
Good question. I don't know. And we don't know. You would think a declining immune system might mean that vitiligo might get better, right? Because, if it's caused by the immune system, if it's this military force and the military is getting weaker, maybe vitiligo would just get weaker as you age. And the problem is the immune system is not as simple as we often talk about it. So the immune system is a very complicated system to help you fight viruses and bacteria and cancers and all that. But there are checks and balances in the immune system to prevent it from getting out of hand, from causing autoimmunity, right? You can imagine if your immune system all of a sudden didn't like your brain and started attacking it, you'd have multiple sclerosis. And so there are lots of checks in the immune system to prevent it from overreacting. And one of the problems as we age, it's not just the bad part of the strong part of the immune system that ages, but also the checks that ages. And so sometimes if the balancing part of the immune system it declines first, then you might get more reactions and more autoimmunity. And a lot of times we see this with itch in the skin. The skin gets itchy as you get older. There's a lot of reasons for that. But one of those reasons we think is because part of the immune system that shuts off the other parts kind of gets weak, and then the other parts overreact to things.
Brilliant.
And I see patients with vitiligo at all ages. So I've seen patients in, babies with vitiligo. I've seen, people at the age of 85 get vitiligo for the first time. So it can happen at any age.
Brilliant. So Susan asks, why does it take the FDA so long to approve drugs?
Safety. So they want to be safe. They don't want to approve anything that's going to make people sick or hurt them. Although you might ask the question, COVID vaccine's going to get approved pretty fast, just in a few weeks. And some of that is just because of, you can get accelerated approval through the FDA. If there's a real huge need, sometimes it can get pushed through the FDA faster. And that's the case with COVID vaccine for sure. It takes about a year for the FDA to review all the data and to make a formal decision that something should be approved. And we actually tried to get the accelerated approval for the topical Insight ruxolitinib cream. We asked them, but they kind of said no. So, we tried. They said there are different phase studies. The study that I showed you, that data was the phase 2 trial in 157 patients. The FDA usually requires a third phase, and that third phase trial is in 600 patients. So a lot more with one dose instead of 150 with 5 doses. You need to do 600 with just 2 doses. So you have a lot more people to look at. Sometimes you can get something approved just after phase 2, but that's just things like the COVID vaccine and things that are killing people, and we just don't have anything else. They made us do the bigger study for the vitiligo cream.
Brilliant. So Saghar has asked, you mentioned hair dyes. Which particular chemicals in particular aggravate vitiligo? And are there any hair dyes that have done this to your knowledge?
So we think it is PPD, in hair dyes. It's called paraphenylenediamine, PPD. And that's, you'll see it either the long word or the PPD, but essentially that chemical is in every permanent hair dye. There's no way to make a permanent hair dye without PPD. So that also tells you that dyes that are not permanent probably are safe for vitiligo. But the hair dye companies would love to have the answer to this. If they could find a substitute that doesn't cause vitiligo, that would be great. Other chemicals that cause vitiligo, the first one that was ever discovered was in the 1930s, actually. It's called monobenzyl ether of hydroquinone. And this was a chemical in the gloves of a bunch of factory workers. And so they're putting gloves on their hands to protect themselves from the chemicals they were working with. But the chemical in the glove, monobenzyl ether, would leach out into their skin, and that actually induced vitiligo. So they don't use that chemical in making gloves anymore. It's really not available anymore, except as a prescription. So in the 70s, the chair of Harvard, Tom Fitzpatrick, said, if a chemical in a glove can cause vitiligo, maybe we could use it as a treatment if there's anybody who has really bad vitiligo and just wants to remove the rest of their color. So that's the bleaching cream. He kind of took the chemical that was put in the glove and just put it into a cream and gave it to people, and it worked. But not too many people want to remove all the rest of their pigment. So it's not a treatment we use all that often.
Great.
It's
So
what Michael Jackson used, though.
Okay. So we've got a very interesting question from Rosie, and she says, does a 3-day water fast have any impact on stem cell production? And would it be effective to reset the immune system?
No, not that we can tell. People have tried a lot of different dietary changes as well, and they've been studied, and we really don't see anything obvious in the diet that will help or hurt the vitiligo. Whether it's, fasting, water fasting, food fasting, or ketone diets or paleo diet, all those things. There's just celiac diet, cutting gluten out, generally does not appear to affect the vitiligo. Now I can say that I have a number of patients who each one of them strongly believes that something they changed in their diet ended up helping, but there's nothing consistent. Everybody says something different. And believe it or not, on one day I had one patient who came in and said, as soon as I started taking vitamin C, my vitiligo got better. And the very next patient said, as soon as I stopped taking vitamin C and cut fruits out of my diet, my vitiligo got better. So, it's just, there's nothing consistent coming out.
Brilliant. So we've got a question from Juan, and it's quite a lengthy question, so I'll do it in 2 stages. So firstly, he would like to thank you for the tremendous treatment that you're doing on vitiligo. So my soon-to-be 6-year-old daughter was diagnosed with vitiligo in July. In addition to UVB narrowband treatment and the topical creams, our doctor recommended alpha lipoic acid, 100 milligrams twice a week. What are your thoughts on that?
So alpha lipoic acid is a supplement that is supposed to be an antioxidant. And people think that antioxidants might be helpful for vitiligo because oxidative stress kind of helps to make melanocytes sick. It's a good idea. And alpha lipoic acid was tested in one study along with a bunch of other vitamins and herbal supplements and things. It hasn't impressed me. I haven't seen data that has really impressed me that it does a lot. So I don't prescribe it for my patients. I don't recommend it. If I was recommending everything that somebody said worked without really any evidence for it, there would be thousands of things: copper bracelets and drinking copper out of water pots and avoiding fish with milk. And, there's some things with goats. It's just like, there's a whole zillion things. Without any evidence, I don't recommend it because my patients' heads would be spinning when they leave the clinic. So the only thing I recommend really are the hard and fast, clear, proven medicines that I have experience with and I've seen work. I try to keep things simple. That said, though, I think alpha lipoic acid won't hurt. So I don't think there's a problem with using it. I just tell patients not to spend a ton of money, chasing after all these things. The good news is that the light treatment and the topical cream should work. So I don't think you need alpha lipoic acid. That's assuming that it's not segmental vitiligo. So if your 5-year-old daughter got vitiligo, there's actually a decent chance it's segmental. It's on one side of the body. If that's the case, it's a little bit harder to treat. And the way to know is you look at the hairs in that spot. If the hairs have turned white, then it's going to be really hard to treat. But if there's still normal pigment, then it should respond.
And the second part to Joan's question is, do you think a multivitamin is important for a 6-year-old with vitiligo? And if so, any thoughts on what to look for in that particular multivitamin?
Nope. Same reasons as before. Yeah. I actually wrote a blog. I have a blog on my website. If you just Google Vitiligo Harris blog, I answer a lot of these questions. They're all kind of listed there because people ask these things all the time. But I have one about, diet and supplements for vitiligo, and I go through all the things I just said and why I don't think they're helpful.
Great. And Saghar has asked, teeth whitening with the use of the blue light, does that adversely affect vitiligo at all?
No, don't think so.
Question from, so I'm just scrolling down because they're coming in as I'm speaking. Question from Sarah, do zinc tablets help with vitiligo?
Don't think so. Actually, people talk about zinc. So the thing is with all these vitamins, if your diet is anywhere close to a normal diet, you're getting all the vitamins your body possibly needs. And anything you take in addition to that, you're just gonna, your body will get rid of because it's too much. So we call it expensive urine. If your diet is not normal, though, you may need to supplement. There's some people who, actually still get scurvy. We still see them in the clinic because they just won't eat any fruits. They like 100% only eat meat. In that kind of diet, of course, you need to supplement vitamin C or you'll be ill. Or sometimes people don't get enough iron because they're vegetarians or pescatarians or so they need to get iron supplementation. But if you have a relatively normal diet, you get everything that you need, and supplementation isn't necessary.
So we've got a question from house number 122. Did the InSight results show major differences across age groups?
Now you're making me remember back, digging deep. Not major. So everybody responded. So there's not like older people didn't respond, younger people did. I think that there was a slight difference that the younger you were, the more more likely you were to respond in a positive way. But what was a little bit confusing was that the longer you had vitiligo, actually the better response you had. So that was a little confusing. If you had vitiligo for less than 10 years, versus more than 10 years. Those who had it for more than 10 years actually got a better response than less. We don't know why that would be. So that doesn't quite agree with the age either, right? Because the older you tend to be, you might be more likely to have had vitiligo longer. So we just don't know the answer to that. But the short answer is, I think it really helps all ages.
Brilliant. I've got a question from Hannah. I'm 34 years old and have had vitiligo since I was 5 years old. I've never had any treatment in the UK. Do I need to get my thyroid checked, or how do I go about getting more answers as an adult?
I'm also 44 years old. I wonder if we were born at the same time. So you've had vitiligo a long time, and so your risk is increased if you have vitiligo for having thyroid disease. But it's not very high, right? There's an 80% likelihood you'll never get thyroid disease in your life. This is a little bit, there are disagreements among the vitiligo experts of the world and dermatologists of the world. A lot of them actually do check every vitiligo patient for thyroid function. So they'll do a blood test just to make sure the thyroid is okay. I actually don't do that. I don't like to stick a lot of people with needles, particularly I see a lot of kids with vitiligo, and I just don't want to be the needle doctor if I don't have to. And I don't feel strongly that we need to check every year, every single vitiligo patient just to see if they have thyroid disease. If you have thyroid disease, you're going to know it because you'll get symptoms, weight gain, weight loss, feeling really hot or feeling really cold, hair loss, mood changes, difficulty sleeping. All those things kind of indicate that something else is going on. So if any of my patients have that, then thyroid is the first thing I check. But usually, if they're feeling fine and they have vitiligo, I don't check it. And most people will never get thyroid disease.
A question from Anthony: what about using narrowband UVB treatment on sensitive areas like the genitals? Are there any risks?
Well, that's kind of a long answer. There was a study done in 1990 that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, a highly respected journal. And they were essentially looking at a different type of light treatment called PUVA. That is UVA light combined with a drug called Sorlin that starts with P. So if you take Sorlin with a P and then add UVA, that's PUVA. And that's what we used to use for vitiligo. And this study actually found that PUVA increases the risk of skin cancer a lot. So after 200 treatments, your risk of skin cancer goes through the roof. And that paper is the paper that told us that and really educated the public. So at the end of that paper, they did another little study and they were like, oh, I wonder about UVB. And so they had a few patients who got UVB. They weren't trying to look at UVB. They were looking at PUVA, and then not very many people had been given UVB because it was so early. It hadn't been really discovered yet, but they did have a population of people with UVB. And they looked and they said, does UVB cause cancer? Maybe we can answer that question at the same time. And they found the answer was no. So while PUVA caused tons of skin cancer, when they looked at the few people they had with given UVB, they did not have a higher risk of skin cancer. And so they reported that. But when they subpopulated those out and they said, and they looked at men versus women, and then they looked whether you got the UVB on your face versus the hands versus other areas, the one thing that they saw was maybe men had a higher risk of skin cancer on the genitals when they got UVB. Whereas PUVA caused it everywhere, they said, oh, actually male genitals, UVB might have and it wasn't very strong, but it might have a risk of skin cancer. And then they published that. So now for the next 30 years, we've been not treating any men on the genitals with UVB because of our fear that it might cause cancer. Without getting too detailed, you might ask, well, why male genitals and not female genitals? And you know, is it just spurious and it wasn't a real finding and it was just by chance they found that and it's not real? But because of, and we could talk a lot about that if we were willing to get into a lot of detail. But I would say overall, that's the reason we generally tell men to cover their genitals when they're getting light therapy and not women. That said, the male genitals actually don't get much better if they have vitiligo because there's not a lot of hair growing there. And so without that, we don't see a lot of improvement. Now, if it's above and in the pubic area where there is hair on either men or women, you can get a lot of improvement and that's fine, but it's just not on the genitals themselves.
Natalie, can I just interject very quickly? I'm aware that we've got probably about 4 minutes left, so maybe time for a couple more questions. And we had one question that came through right at the start, which we've missed, which I'd just like to share because it came from one of our trustees. So he was first in line. He says, it's from John Dunster. He said, thanks so much for donating your time to share your knowledge with us. My question is around the link between mental health, in brackets, particularly depression, and any link to the onset of vitiligo. I've been receiving treatment for depression this year and have begun repigmenting. I wonder if the antidepressants may be playing a role in that. Thanks.
Interesting. So there is a link between mental health and vitiligo, depression and vitiligo. Usually we think it's the other way around, that you get vitiligo and then that can really affect your outlook and how you feel about yourself. And people with vitiligo, when we do studies, tend to be more depressed and have more sad feelings compared to those without vitiligo. But you're commenting on a very different thing, having depression first, having vitiligo, getting treated for depression and the vitiligo getting better. And there have not been reports of that. And there are reports though that, stress worsens vitiligo. So could you imagine that if your stress level goes down or your outlook gets better or you're overall a more positive thinker, could your vitiligo get better? I think that's possible. I would love to test, actually, mindfulness by John Kabat-Zinn was actually discovered at my institution at UMass. And it's a wonderful way to relieve stress and just kind of relax and rest your mind. And we'd love to test that as a treatment for vitiligo, but we haven't done that. I've always wondered if you get like anxiety treatments. There are a number of medicines you can get for anxiety. I haven't thought as much about depression. Maybe that would help the vitiligo as the way we talked about, just by calming you and relieving stress. But we don't know. Outside of that, we don't know. But it's comments like that that actually teach us a lot and get us thinking, and I won't forget that one.
Fantastic, thank you, John. I'm aware that you've got a hard stop at past. There's a number of questions that we didn't get to in the chat. Is there a way that we can follow up with you after and come back to everyone on the questions that we missed?
Yeah, possibly. I mean, I don't have a time to type a bunch of answers to a bunch of questions. I'm way behind on my blog, actually. But maybe check out my blog at least just to see if I've already answered it. There might be, because most of the questions I was asked today, I've got a blog post on. So that could be a good resource.
Fantastic. We'll share that after. Well, John, it's been fantastic to have you join the summit. Thank you for opening for us and sharing your immense knowledge. I'm sure everyone on the call is as grateful as I am that you've taken the time.
Happy to be here. Yeah, it's my passion, and I love to talk to people and answer questions. So it's been a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks everybody. Enjoy your meeting.
Thank you. Fantastic.
Actually, I've got a research meeting next to try to cure vitiligo, so I'll get to that.
Good luck.
Yeah. Thanks.
Great. So it's now at 7:30. We're going to take a 10-minute intermission. So feel free to grab another drink, use your amenities, and we'll reconvene in 10 minutes. So at 7:40 p.m. Enjoy and look forward to seeing you back here shortly. And I hope everyone is suitably refreshed and enjoyed the first session. Next up, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Victoria Eleftheriadou. I really hope I'm pronouncing that right. Dr. Eleftheriadou has a specialist interest in vitiligo and pediatric dermatology. She currently works at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital in Birmingham, and she completed her PhD in vitiligo at the Centre for Evidence-Based Dermatology at the University of Nottingham. Today, she will present an update of the British Association of Dermatologists, that's the BAD, clinical guidelines on the treatment of vitiligo. So, Victoria, I am going to hand over to you. Hopefully you should be able to unmute and share your screen and camera.
Okay, yes, thank you very much, Simon, and thank you everyone for being here today. I'm really pleased to meet all of you virtually, and I will present these guidelines today, which are essentially based on very hard work of a very large group of people, which I have the honor to lead for over 4 years. So it's taken us that long to go through all the evidence and produce some recommendations on the treatment as to what works and what doesn't. And these guidelines are in the last stage of being published. And I will talk you through the process as well as the actual recommendations. So let me share the screen. Oh, sorry. Right, so share screen. God, it has a exclamation mark. I'm not sure whether that's right.
Well, on the Zoom application.
Yeah, when I share screen, it doesn't actually show the, let's say PowerPoint unknown. God, is it me being, hang on. Okay, not sure what to do. Sure. Okay. Oh, okay, hang on, I think I've got it. Can you?
Yes, looking good.
On screen now.
Yes.
Can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, good. Excellent, good.
Panic over.
Okay. Yeah. Excellent. So, okay, so I presented the same presentation just recently, a month ago, at the European meeting of the Dermatology Venerology. So that's where these nice. Oh, right. Yeah. Yes. So these are my disclosures. So I have been involved in research for many, in vitiligo research for many years, and in particular in Highlight trial, which some of you might have came across. It's on handheld devices, light devices on vitiligo, as well as obviously the guidelines. So today I will talk you through about the vitiligo guidelines, their purpose, the methodology, the results, and subsequently the recommendations. So why do we need guidelines? So as you can imagine, being a dermatologist, you have to treat many different skin conditions, and vitiligo being one of them. In the last 100 years, in the last 50 years, let's say, there have been over 100 of interventions tested for vitiligo. So in order to be able to be up to date with what actually works or not, it's pretty much impossible if for you know a dermatologist, because it's impossible to read every paper which comes out. Therefore, that's where the guidelines are coming into play. So These national guidelines are recommendations to every dermatologist and patients how to treat vitiligo and what works best and what doesn't work. We looked into literature from 1970, I would say, to February 2020. So everything which is out there have been published for vitiligo, large or small. So this is the group of the main group of the authors, and it consists of course, dermatologists. We also have clinical psychologists on our panel, patient representatives, and a technical group, which provides methodological support. After we look into the actual evidence and produce recommendations, we then send our recommendations to a wider group. So essentially we send it to the British Photodermatology group, to the British Nursing group, to the Primary Care Dermatological Society, the British Society of Pediatric Dermatologists, and so on and on and on. So many people, many specialists in different disciplines surrounding vitiligo read these guidelines and comment on them before they're actually being published. So you can imagine how much work go into these. So, and now the methodology. So the BAD guidelines are renowned worldwide for the robust methodology. These guidelines have been developed with reference to the grading of recommendation, assessment, and development and evaluation, also known as GRADE. So essentially, it's a quite complicated methodology, which I will show you a slide in a minute, simplified slide. But it is a gold standard, essentially, of how to produce guidelines. So the BAD guidelines are NICE accredited, which means that the NICE have given the seal of approval that the methodology is so robust and so good that they are happy that these are national guidelines. Just a quick reminder what NICE is. NICE stands for National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, and they produce clinical guidelines for all the diseases across medicine, starting from heart, finishing with dermatology. So these are, this is the body which, for example, say you're going to treat the hypertension with such and such medication, and everyone does that. So essentially, NICE is saying that BAD guidelines, including vitiligo, are quite robust. So we should follow them. So this is just a quick overview of the actual methodology, the GRADE methodology. So first of all, we formulate the research question. We ask the question, what do we want to answer? We want to answer, for example, do topical steroids work for vitiligo? Are topical steroids better than light? And things like that. So we formulate the question first, and we based our questions on what is important to patients, as well as clinicians who are treating these patients in the clinic. So then we define the outcomes, which means how we're going to measure, what exactly we're going to look in the results. Because the thing is that there is a big problem in vitiligo research, which my group is currently trying to sort of bring consensus in, is that if you imagine 100 of different trials and they all use different rulers to measure the effectiveness of the treatment, it is pretty much impossible to then compare and say, yeah, that cream works better, but you used a scale like that, and then I used a scale like that. So how we can then compare them? So that's a problem. So we need to look into the outcomes, which is another important aspect. So then when we decide what we're going to measure, we extract that from the literature. So we literally read the trials, get the results, get the outcomes we want and we consider are important in order to answer our question. So that actually can take years, and it has. So then, based on the methodology of each trial, we then say, okay, here is a trial, but this trial was pretty small. The methodology of it was not very clear. So can we definitely say that this cream has worked? Probably not, based on the bias, if the study was biased. So we look into that as well, not just the result. So if someone published a study, it doesn't mean, and it's been published in a journal, doesn't mean necessarily that it's good, and doesn't mean necessarily that we should follow the advice the researchers are suggesting. So that's why we downgrade and upgrade papers and the results. And then we sit together literally in many meetings and produce our recommendations, and then send them to the wider group for consideration. So here just a quick diagram of so how many trials we looked into. So we identified 13,000 trials, and we considered 77 of them. We included 77 of them into our review. That literally took a few years to complete. And here are the recommendations. So just to quickly tell you that this is just few recommendations. It's a flow chart essentially. In the actual guidelines, there are about 30 recommendations, which are in more details and say specifically what and how to apply and how to use it. So what we consider needs to be done when a patient comes to the clinic is that we need to take a full history, including the type of vitiligo, segmental, which is one side of the body, or non-segmental, which is symmetrical. We also need to know whether disease is stable or not. We also need to know how extensive it is, whether it just covers 10% of your body, 50% or 80%. And we need to know all these things, because on that will depend the treatment we will suggest to you. So you might think that these are things probably self-explanatory, but unfortunately no, these things not all dermatologists ask these things, unfortunately, and that's why we need to include them in our general recommendations and say exactly what they need to document and ask the patients. So the other important thing is that we need to screen all patients with vitiligo for thyroid antibodies and thyroid function, because they are at high risk of developing thyroid autoimmune diseases. So sometimes you can have vitiligo before you develop thyroid, but it can work also the other way. You might have a thyroid disease without realizing it, might be mild, and then you develop vitiligo. So these are the cases we're trying to catch. Also, a discussion needs to be going on between patient and clinician, how much vitiligo affects the quality of life, because there are things, simple things, starting from self-help up to referral to appropriate services can be done to help patients to cope with the vitiligo. So that's why we suggest several questionnaires in particular in order to be able to screen for psychological stress in a busy clinic where you have 10-15 minutes for a patient. Also, consider vitamin D supplement. That is partially being because people with vitiligo do avoid sun, so it is very important to consider that taking vitamin D. And of course, consider cosmetic camouflage, which is not a treatment, but it is something which can help patients to cope with the vitiligo. And there are services who can help with that and can teach you how to use that professionally. Okay, so another very important recommendation, which we need to recommend to all our patients when we see in our clinic, is we need to remind them and offer them sunscreen of 4 or 5 star UVA rating and factor 50 SPF to be applied on vitiligo patches and surrounding skin before going outdoors into the sun. Reason for that is partially because vitiligo patches, as many of you I'm sure know if you have vitiligo, burn easily. So you need to protect your skin from burns essentially. And when you go to the sun, then vitiligo can also become more visible because the skin around vitiligo can tan, where the inside doesn't. So that's why we recommend applying on the surrounding skin, trying to avoid the tanning process, which will make vitiligo more noticeable. So that's again vitamin D. So with regards to the actual treatment, this is pretty much in alliance with what John said. So we recommend offering potent or very potent topical corticosteroid. Unfortunately, current practice shows us that many patients with vitiligo go and see their GPs and been told, no, there isn't anything for vitiligo, or take that hydrocortisone, maybe even try it. So that will never help because hydrocortisone is the mildest steroid ever, and that will never help with vitiligo. So what we want to do is encourage GPs to start using a stronger steroid, which can actually have a much better effect on vitiligo. Then we have the tacrolimus, which is calcium inhibitor. We recommend applying that twice daily on face, especially around the eyes, because it is a steroid-sparing cream. Well, it's an ointment essentially. It's steroid-sparing topical treatment, which means that it does not have the side effects of the topical corticosteroids, such as thinning of the skin, for example. Hence, you can use it for longer. Or you can do what John suggested, alternate topical corticosteroid and topical tacrolimus week on, week off. So that will depend on the area which we're treating, as well as whether you had other treatments or not. Second line. So we tried that, let's say, and there is some sort of improvement, and then you feel that it hasn't achieved what you you were hoping for. Then the second line would be narrowband UVB in addition to the topical corticosteroid or tacrolimus. So you would use both treatments. Currently, for vitiligo patients, to begin with, you probably, if you wanted to go into been referred to secondary care for narrowband UVB, you probably found it very, very hard, and that you have to wait for ages to get there. And then when you get there, you probably have widespread vitiligo, and that's not going to be much sort of effective. So what we are suggesting is that obviously it will be in centers where they can offer that you can have narrowband UVB in handheld devices, which means small devices which you can use at home in addition to the topical corticosteroids and topical tacrolimus. So that potentially gives you an option of treating few vitiligo patches in a comfort of your own home, in addition to topical corticosteroids and tacrolimus, so a combination treatment. Then we also have a treatment option for widespread vitiligo. So for example, when you have patches which are stable for quite some time, that's a different story. But people find it very distressing and worrisome when they suddenly develop many vitiligo patches and they're spreading. So a good way to stop that is to have oral steroids in addition to narrowband UVB. And third line, this is again quite specialized treatments, which we have indicated in our guidelines that are only going to be available in specific centers, depending on what clinicians are going to be working there, how happy they are to do these treatments, etc., etc. But potentially these treatments are effective to a degree. So first of all, surgical intervention with vitiligo, such as cellular grafting. Second, it's 5-FU, which is essentially a treatment which is currently used for skin cancers. Having said that, I want to note that we are not suggesting that treatment because we think there's some sort of link between vitiligo, skin cancer, or anything like that. But what 5-FU does, it sort of destroys the top level of the skin and in skin cancers. So what this recommendation suggests is that we use the same cream to sort of very gently abrase maybe the skin. So in order for it to be activated and produce new skin, which will grow and hopefully will repigment better. And we suggest that on areas such as hands and feet, which are notoriously difficult to treat and usually repigment the last, if ever, to be honest. But again, that's a third line treatment, which means quite last resort. And of course, you have depigmentation treatment, where you essentially have more white skin rather than your normal pigmented skin, and you just eliminate whatever pigment is left, the islands of the normal skin, and therefore you will be all sort of white. So this is the short algorithm, and as I said, there are more than around 30 recommendations which are a bit more specific than that, but it gives you a nice overview of what we are recommending, which means that you as patients can also be informed, and when you see your doctors, you can pinpoint and say, well, look, I read upon that, because some people, you know, I have to admit, some dermatologists do not always necessarily are up to date with the recent guidelines. But if you are and you tell them, look, the guideline said such and such thing, can I please try that? So that's gonna work with you. Okay, so that's a short summary of the guidelines, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Victoria. Did I pronounce your surname correctly or incorrectly?
No, it was fine. So. Yeah.
I apologize. I might just move to Dr. V, so it's a bit easier.
Exactly. Dr. Victoria, usually that's how they call me in the hospital. So
Nat, I'm going to hand over to you, please, if that's okay.
Yep, fantastic. Okay, so thanks very much for that, Dr. V. We have had a few questions come in, so I'm going to just read them from my spreadsheet first, and then I'll refer to the ones in the chat. So first question from Salma is, there is now a far more effective form of camouflage for vitiligo sufferers developed in Australia called microskin. Mm-hmm. The product is reported to provide coverage for a number of days on the skin. Will this be available on the NHS or subsidised as a subsidised scheme on the NHS or privately?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's hard to answer. It depends. So essentially, every treatment which is available to you in your hospital or at your GP, it's dictated by your by an authority above. So that's why essentially it's up to every area is different, as you know. So unfortunately, it's the case for that. But if it's only been in Australia, I suspect it's pretty much unlikely, unless it's quite popular here, and then CCG will be happy to fund it. But again, if it's a cosmetic sort of treatment, they are a bit stingy with that, I have to say. But we do have, you know, our own services, and maybe through them, maybe they are going to give you better instructions, to be honest.
Brilliant. Thank you. So we have a question from Chantel. So in France, there is a professor that says that vitiligo sufferers are 3 times likely to get skin cancer, and that sun exposure is absolutely key to repigmentation. However, here in the UK, we are told to do exactly the opposite. Wear high factor sunscreen because we have no natural protection and can develop skin cancer easier. This is very contradictory advice from one country to another. What is your opinion, and what advice would you give to your own patients?
So My opinion is the opinion of the BAT guidelines when they come out. So I can tell you what we are recommending. And as I say, we recommend the sunscreen cream to avoid burns, okay, rather than protect from skin cancer. If you do get many burns in the same areas, you are more likely to develop non-melanoma skin cancer, which means not melanoma where, you know, where that's the deadliest skin cancer. There are other minor type of skin cancer which you can develop, and there is research showing that it can develop in burned skin, even in vitiligo. So you do need to wear factor 50 on your skin, because you're still going to tan, okay? There's no way you're not going to tan if you wear that cream. You're still going to tan. But vitiligo patients also, it looks like they have protection from skin cancers, which has been research published in the last few years. It's related to genes. So the genes which give you vitiligo seems to protect you from melanoma. So that's why virtually, I don't think we ever see patients with melanoma and vitiligo. Of course, it's always possible, but it seems to be some sort of a protection from melanotic skin cancers. So I would say, do use sunscreen on your patches, because they will burn, and then you're going to have, you know, other issues with your skin. But you can't go into the sun. Yes, there's no way to hide away from the sun completely. A bit of sun exposure it's good. Yeah.
Great, thank you. So we've got a question from Saida. Have there been any profound breakthroughs in the treatment of vitiligo? And if so, why is the NHS still only offering old treatments?
So breakthrough means that there was a trial or two. For example, the JAK inhibitor where John was referring before, there was a trial, but the trial was very small. So that's not enough for us to be able to roll it out into the NHS. So so if you can imagine, as I mentioned before, there are over 100 treatments being trialed. Many of them had initial good results, which were then not be able to replicate. Were not replicated when the trials were bigger, or they never reached a bigger trial because the funding bodies, which need to award the money to the scientist who believes in that drug, were not convinced that the evidence was strong enough. So unfortunately, there are steps, and they are there for patient safety, because at the end of the day, where patients are not guinea pigs, we need to be sure that we're using something which is effective but also safe, not just because it has worked on 100 or 50 patients.
Brilliant. So I'm going to just go over to the chat now. So Sarah has asked, where is CO2 laser and 5U available in the UK? Is it only available at certain hospitals or clinics?
Yes, that is a very good question, and you know, it's we've been asking ourselves as a group, and also as a group of experts. We've been looking into that. And there are not many hospitals. I cannot give you a list of hospitals which use that. And also it's going to be a matter of whether they're going to be happy to start this treatment. But the reason we have put that in the guidelines is because it ultimately suggests that based on evidence and based on expert opinion, people should start using that treatment more often. If we don't put it there just because it has not been used much, you know, in NHS hospital, it will never be. So we are sort of trying to push it. But unfortunately, Sarah, it's there are not many hospitals. No, not at the moment, but maybe when the vitiligo guidelines are out and patients are asking for it, they might give them an incentive to actually fund these devices.
Great. Ina has asked, has fermented vitamin D and gut health been researched around vitiligo?
So there is it's a very sort of modern topic between the gut health and skin. And I know there's been lots of research on that for eczema, for example, but unfortunately not for vitiligo. No, it's a very good thought, though.
I think we're thanks, Nat. Well, I think we're at time there. Dr. V, thank you very much for your time and coming on and presenting that. It's nice to see that the what we're doing in the UK and the BAD is used as quite widely, you know, around Europe as some of the gold standard of vitiligo treatment. So it's great to see. I'm very, very grateful for you coming on and presenting, and thank you very much.
Pleasure. Enjoy.
Thank you. Excellent. So I hope everyone is still with us and going strong. Next up, I'd like to introduce our final speaker, Dr. Alia Ahmed. Dr. Ahmed is a consultant dermatologist with a special interest in psychological effects of skin conditions. She completed her dermatology training in London, including a research fellowship in psychodermatology. Dr. Ahmed also has a Bachelor of Science in Psychology with clinical psychology. She is particularly interested in the effect of stress on the skin, and Dr. Ahmed strongly believes the interaction between the brain, skin, and mind is key to achieving healthy skin. So Alia, it's over to you for the home stretch. Thank you for joining.
Hi everyone, thank you. So thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you to everyone in the organising committee for inviting me to speak to you today. For those of you who don't know, I have previously done some work some years ago looking at the psychological impact of vitiligo, and this was quite heavily supported by the Vitiligo Society. So even though it was a while ago, I extend my thanks again to the Society for helping me through that research. Now I'm going to try and share my screen, and it's always possible that I can get it wrong. So we'll give this a go, and you can tell me, probably Simon, if everything is showing the way it should show.
Yeah, it's looking good. We can see
Fine.
it.
Okay, so we'll start at the beginning. Like you said, my name is Dr. Alia. I'm a dermatologist, and I have a special interest in the psychological impact of skin conditions. And this is why we have this term psychodermatology, and I would call myself a psychodermatologist because that's, I think, a really good way to describe the way I work. Today, I'd like to speak to you about mental health and skin disease. Now, you've had some excellent presentations before me that spoke about vitiligo specifically, and we had, Dr. V gave a really nice presentation about treatment options available and also where we are with the guidelines. I look forward to seeing those in print, and I'm sure they'll be out soon. I'd like to talk to you about mental health and skin disease in general, but of course this does apply to vitiligo as well. And I will be also mentioning or spending quite a lot of time talking about the recent report, which is titled the same, Mental Health and Skin Disease, and taking you through some of those key findings. Because although any skin condition is amenable to treatment, some of those treatments are not always successful. And there is a shift now, I feel, where people want to know more about what else they can do apart from medically managing their skin and how they can learn to live with their skin condition. So these are my relevant disclosures. And just firstly, I'd like to explain to you what psychodermatology is. So we see patients in two sort of very broad groups. The first are those patients who have skin conditions which are associated with psychological or psychiatric comorbidity. So those are conditions like acne, alopecia or hair loss, eczema, psoriasis, getting hives, vitiligo. And patients with these conditions will present to us with their skin problem, but they will also have issues with, for example, anxiety or depression. And these all require some form of treatment or at least acknowledgement. We also see patients with primary psychiatric conditions that present with skin disease. So that's things like body dysmorphia. So when someone has a perception about themselves which is not entirely true to what can be seen, skin picking disorder and hair pulling disorder. So quite different groups of patients that we see, and our aim is always to treat them appropriately dermatologically, but also address the psychological impact of their skin conditions. And we will use several techniques for that, not only oral medication, we will look at psychological interventions and basic talking therapies as well. So we can't do this alone. I work with a team of people, so there will usually be a dermatologist with an interest in psychodermatology like myself. We are always supported by our excellent dermatology nurses, and where possible, we do like to have psychiatrists and psychologists on the team. And some of our teams, especially the team I work with at the Royal London Hospital, when we're seeing our patients, we often will see patients together with our psychiatry colleagues in the same room. So you'll be seen by a dermatologist and a psychiatrist at the same time. This busy slide is just to take you through something called psychoneuroimmunology. So Simon already mentioned that my interest is in stress and skin disease. And this is something that I feel people ask me a lot more about compared to previously. So people will often say, no matter what their skin condition is, and including my patients with vitiligo, could this be something to do with stress? Could stress have kicked this off? And my answer is usually it may have, because we have some really good evidence for this. So the basis of this diagram is just telling us that when you experience emotional distress or stress, these feelings are recognized by the brain, and the brain has what we call a stress response. And often as part of the stress response, your body will release a number of chemicals and hormones which affect the immunity of your body and your skin. So it can affect skin immunity and also pro-inflammatory response. So that means that the inflammation in your body is upregulated. And what we see in the skin is the presentation of inflammatory skin conditions, for example, eczema and psoriasis, autoimmune conditions like alopecia areata, and also allergic skin disorders. So I will say to patients that yes, stress can cause skin disease and skin disease can cause stress. And this can become a vicious cycle, which is for some people very difficult to break out of. So I'm going to spend some time now talking about the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Skin report on mental health and skin disease. Now, this came out, I think, around September this year, and the report was compiled by a panel of independent experts in skin disease with representation from national patient support networks and organisations. And the report looks into the mental health impact of skin conditions and also highlights areas for improvement. It's freely available, so you can use the link that I've listed, and you'll be able to read the report in full if you're interested. So essentially, the report makes a number of key recommendations and also highlights some of the improvements that we need to make in our mental health services for patients with skin disease. So we know that the psychosocial impact of skin conditions has been underestimated by healthcare professionals. And this report highlights this, but I think we already all sort of knew that. And I can definitely say that this is a problem across the board. So it's not just, for example, GPs, it's also hospital doctors, it's also our allied healthcare professionals. People didn't really realize how much having a skin condition can affect a person psychologically, and because of this underestimation, sometimes this can be quite difficult for the person to deal with and can lead them towards a downward spiral. And I definitely remember from my research previously with patients with vitiligo, when we were talking about the psychological impact, how bad people felt when they were told by the first doctor, for example, that they saw that there was no treatment for their skin condition and they would just have to live with it. And we did highlight this result when we published that previous research as a way to show our colleagues that firstly, that's wrong information, as you've seen today from the talks that you've had before mine, and secondly, it can lead to quite negative feelings and negative emotions. So all patients with any skin condition should be at least offered the correct level of information by the healthcare professional that they see. We also know that skin disease can impact all aspects of people's lives, including from school age, relationships, self-esteem and career choices, and also including social, sexual and leisure activities. Patients experience isolation, embarrassment, shame, depression and anxiety. They can also feel stigmatized and feel that they are being discriminated against, and there's a lack of social acceptance and understanding, and this can be experienced on a daily basis by some people. So in spite of knowing this and having this information to hand, there is still a huge lack of provision of psychological services for adults and children with skin conditions. And just going to the hot topic at the moment, which everybody talks about, which is COVID-19, we already know that the community of people with skin conditions, they're already vulnerable. So they already feel slightly marginalized by society, or maybe ignored, or maybe that their feelings are not being understood. And then we have this global pandemic, and this has made an already vulnerable community even more vulnerable because, for example, their appointments may be being delayed. There might be a different way of seeing people, for example, not forward facing, and we're doing things on the telephone. And sometimes you don't get that effective human touch through that, and it can make some people feel worse than they did originally. Now, one of the important statistics from this report is that 98% of people surveyed reported that their skin affects their psychological and emotional well-being, and there are additional reports of suicidal behavior linked to the impact of having a skin condition. Now, although I already probably knew that so many people feel that their skin affects their well-being, the fact about the suicidal behavior is worrying, and it's something that dermatologists, for example, may not be used to discussing with their patients. I will be able to discuss this because I do it regularly, and I will feel comfortable to ask my patient about this type of behavior if they have ever felt like not living rather than living with their skin condition. But not everybody is comfortable with asking these questions, and this is something that we're working on with dermatologists now to make them understand that actually this conversation needs to be had with all of our patients who have chronic skin conditions. So despite all of this evidence, only 18% of patients surveyed had ever received any form of psychological support, which is very low looking at the number of people who said that they had some evidence of psychological impact. So I'm going to take you through some of the key findings of the report, and mainly about the patient survey. So there was a survey that's part of this report, and it was used to identify and describe the nature of psychological impacts experienced by people living with skin conditions, and also wanted them to describe their experience of seeking support for these issues. Now, the evidence has been taken from patients, from professional medical bodies, patient support groups, and pharmaceutical companies. There was also a parliamentary evidence session. The surveys were two separate surveys. One was for patients with skin conditions, and the other was for organizations with an interest in dermatology. And we also had some patient witnesses who gave oral evidence with regards to how their life had been affected by their skin condition. And in total, 544 individuals contributed to the survey and 16 organizations. Now, this slide is just to show what themes came out of the responses to the survey. So themes and sub-themes, we call them. And some of these really reminded me of the same sort of results that I got from my previous survey, which was solely for those people with vitiligo. So one of the themes was that patients with skin conditions report an adverse psychological impact throughout their life, and that is things like negative feelings of well-being and psychological distress, impact on their perception of their self and self-worth, and importantly, untreated distress in children, creating a lifelong mental health burden. And as we know, many skin conditions, vitiligo included, present in childhood. People also felt that their skin condition was an obstacle to their social and peer group acceptance and had an impact on their emotional and physical intimacy. So that means that their skin condition is affecting their ability to have a relationship, especially a physical relationship, and also affecting their friendships and also their social connectivity. Some people felt that their skin condition was a barrier to their everyday living, work, and education. So not being able to lead what you may call, in inverted commas, a normal life, difficulty in reaching their full potential, barriers to meeting the parenting role. And this is something I remember from, again, previous research where when we asked patients with vitiligo this question, a lot of people did turn around and say, I'm worried about having children because I'm worried about passing this on. So I can understand where that question came from. There's also a general lack of recognition, understanding and acceptance from society of people that have skin conditions. Now, there is definitely a demand for the clinical recognition of psychological impact, and there is a lack of available support. So just to highlight this finding, there's not a lot of support available, and people do want that to be recognized and also to be made available. When it is available, there's usually a lack of specialist support or specific services. So for example, if I have a patient with vitiligo and I want them to see a psychologist or engage with, for example, talking therapies, I will contact the person that I know in that department, explain what the skin condition is, explain what I've seen, explain the impact it's having, and then I will ask them to see the patient with a full understanding of what the skin condition means. But this is not possible in all centres. We know that with the correct level of psychological and social support, the effects of skin condition can be minimised. There's also a lack of specialist paediatric report. Interestingly, more than half of the people surveyed didn't know that they could seek help with the psychological or emotional well-being component associated with their skin conditions. And only 14% of respondents were aware that the NHS has support, or even if it is limited, for people with skin conditions. And many people actually decided to go for the private option, but unfortunately this was expensive and they couldn't keep up with it. So they had it on a short-term basis. So we don't know how helpful that was in the long term. Just some more key results from the survey and some of the statistics, and also some quotes from some of the oral evidence. So, and the words are really profound, and that's why I put them on here, and I'm sure they resonate with many people. So I'll go through the quotes first. So I found job interviews quite hard. If I put my hand out to shake a potential employer's hand, the first thing they would think of is, why was my hand white? The first time I realized I was different was when a young child approached me in the playground at school. He went to put his hand out to touch me and jumped back and said, "I'm not going to touch you because I think your skin is contagious." I would have swimming lessons, and often I would forge sickness notes from my mum because I did not want to go swimming and wear a swimsuit. So these quotes are taken from our oral representation of people with vitiligo. The slide also shows that the high numbers, so we've already talked about 98% of people with skin conditions feeling that it affects their emotional and psychological well-being, 73% reporting a negative effect on intimate relationships, 93% reporting self-esteem issues, 69% affecting their work or study, 83% affecting their sleep, and 87% affecting their social life, leisure or sporting activity. So these are not, small figures, and 5% of people with skin disease were expressing suicidal thoughts. And even though 5% is smaller than the numbers that we've already talked about, that's still 5% too much. So what sort of assessment should we be offering our patients with skin conditions? And this schema or this diagram here and the list of questions are the types of questions that our psychologists would like to ask the patients that they're seeing with skin conditions. And I definitely in my psychodermatology consultations will also ask some of these. So we really need to spend more time in addition to talking about medical management, to also asking patients what their experiences of living with their skin, about their relationships and any significant life events, and what they've experienced in their life, and is it linked to their skin, or did it kick off something with their skin? It's also important to ask what people's current stressors are. And we don't like these consultations to be too negative, and just focus on, okay, so what's gone wrong because of your skin? People will have strengths and we like to focus on those. So literally asking people, so what motivates you? What do you enjoy doing? What makes you happy? And also importantly, what your expectations are from consultations. And that's including your medical treatment, the expectations of your medical treatment and the expectations of its success. So in terms of psychological support, what is actually available? We do have patient support organizations. There are several. And for example, this event is being hosted by the Vitiligo Society. You can ask for counseling via your general practitioner. Talking therapies are also quite freely available, but it's difficult to get onto, especially at the moment, because there are so many people who are experiencing negative effects of the global pandemic. A lot of talking therapies you can services you can self-refer, so it's worth finding out in your local area if you can self-refer, so you don't even have to ask your GP. And most of the time the self-referral is just done online, so you would just need to find out in your area. For example, my area would be Berkshire. When I Google talking therapies Berkshire, I can find out quite easily that I can refer myself without seeing my GP. There are also secondary psychology services. So when things don't go well for you using using your usual counselling services from your GP or talking therapies, then you can be referred to secondary psychology services. You can also be referred to psychiatrists if your symptoms would suggest that. So if you're having severe symptoms of anxiety or low mood. Dermatology departments, my patients tell me, are great sources of support for some, and especially as Dr. V spoke about phototherapy. So phototherapy sessions usually are a number of sessions. So I think you probably have about 100 sessions of phototherapy per sort of treatment schedule for vitiligo. And what I hear from my patients with vitiligo is that the dermatology nurses or the phototherapy nurses that are running the treatments are actually a great source of support for them, because they see them regularly, they develop a relationship with them, and they're able to discuss, you know, even the normal things about their day, the mundane things about their day, and sometimes open up and tell them how they're feeling. So I never underestimate what services are available, even if they're not labeled as, you know, a psychological service. And of course, people can always contact self-help resources, or they can come into contact with them. There are lots of apps available. For example, Headspace is used a lot for mindfulness. And I think that is a really helpful form of stress relieving therapy that you can do yourself, and it teaches you how to ignore any sort of persistent negative thoughts and be able to move on and get on with your day. So it's not about dampening those thoughts, it's about acknowledging them and moving on. The diagram is just some of the again patient survey outcomes about the types of psychological therapy that was received by patients, and you can see mainly counseling and CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, so a psychological intervention, and also medications as well. Quite a number of people received those. You don't always have to have an oral medication just because you have a low mood or you have anxiety. It is usually our last resort. We tend to focus on the psychological treatments first. So in terms of patient support organizations, and this is another point these are other points that were brought out from the report. Patient support organizations are a great source of support for patients, as the name suggests, and also a great source of support for us, because a lot of the time we may not have the time or the resources to be able to direct our patients. And therefore, we should recognize that and give patient support organizations more impact in the way that we're planning services. So we should be considering their lead or support service when we're planning innovation projects. So when we're planning interventions, it would be helpful if we were able to engage with patient support organizations. Some patient support organizations are already providing psychological services. May they be self-help modules online? Could they be written material? And obviously we would encourage that those organizations appropriately train the staff that are involved in delivering these interventions or designing them. And I'm sure everyone is doing that already. Also, we would like to continue inviting patient support organizations to review the services and also review the pathways that patients have in order to express that they're having any psychological problems, in order to build these services. So we really do rely on our partners in this area, like the Vitiligo Society, to tell us what we're doing wrong or where the gaps are, so we can start to fill them. Now, these are just some generic questions that I tend to ask most, if not all, my patients. And some of them are relevant to vitiligo, some of them aren't. But I do tend to ask people how their skin is, whether they're sleeping, because this can be a good indication of whether they may have a mood problem, because often you can't sleep well if you're feeling low in mood or if you're anxious. Itchiness, I ask about because of a lot of inflammatory skin conditions, but I have had patients with vitiligo that have told me that some areas can be itchy sometimes. Asking about concentrating at school or work, are people able to get on with their day? Specific symptoms like feeling tearful, low in mood, anxious or worried. Importantly, if I don't have any time to ask any question, the one question that I will ask, and I encourage all my dermatology colleagues to ask, is, does your skin stop you doing the things you want to in life? It's the most important question in the consultation, in my opinion, because this is what's going to tell me how much treatment I need to offer this patient and how I need to manage their expectations. I can say, you know, I can offer you this. I don't know if it's going to help, but we can try this. But what are you going to do if it doesn't work? Also asking about relationships and physical relationships, social life, managing skin. Now, we heard in the last talk about application of topical steroids, and also the non-steroid containing treatments for vitiligo. For some people, it might not actually be practically possible to apply those treatments. So it's really important to ask people, will you even be able to do what I'm suggesting? Or shall we just skip to the next phase of treatment? Or shall we consider no treatment at all? That's always an option. And importantly, like I mentioned earlier, we must ask our patients if they've ever thought about hurting themselves, if they made a plan, if they told anyone, and what stopped them from going through with it. It gives us a lot of insight about their support networks as well. So what do I do with my patients who have vitiligo that come to see me? So like any dermatologist, I will always ask, you know, a full history, examine my patients, perform relevant investigations, and also discuss the management options like Dr. V presented to you before me. I will, in addition, have discussions about quality of life and discussions about the psychological impact of their skin condition. And usually that's the most telling part of the consultation, and the one that I enjoy, you know, that's the bit that I wait for, that I want to see how this patient is living when they're outside of my consultation room. I always provide information about patient support networks because they're so important. And most importantly, it's about managing expectations. So a lot of people with vitiligo will say, okay, well, I'll try this treatment. Is it going to work? And I have to honestly tell them it may or it may not. And maybe if I have any statistics to hand, I will try and share them. And I will often talk about the fact that what are you going to do if it doesn't work? And how can we already prepare to make sure that you're able to deal with things if they don't work out? What are you going to do? And this doesn't have to happen in one consultation. This is something that happens over, you know, a series of consultations. Now, this is just my last slide. It's not all sort of doom and gloom in psychodermatology. There are so many positive things, and there are so many positive people who influence people with skin conditions. And also there are a lot of changes in the way people are viewing skin conditions or visible differences. So this slide is just to highlight some of that. We know that we have changing faces. We have some excellent patient resources specific to vitiligo. I've already mentioned the Vitiligo Society. There are also people that you can follow online or look at their work online. So there is an Instagram account for somebody called the Vitiligo Kid. There's a picture of Shankar Jalota here, who is like a vitiligo influencer, and his Instagram page, The Vitiligo Man, includes a lot of information about feelings and about living with vitiligo. And he's done some amazing work with acceptance and making skin conditions inclusive. So not ignoring people with skin conditions or assuming that's because they have a skin condition, they have a disease. It's not always a disease. It's a condition, and it may be a problem for some, but maybe we shouldn't be calling it a disease anymore. I also have Emiko Johnson, who is based in the US, and she's another vitiligo influencer. There are hashtags that you can follow, hashtag skin positive. The British Skin Foundation also is there to support people and to point people in the right direction if they have a skin condition and they want to interact with the patient support network or interact with their GP more effectively. So please feel free, of course, you will have the opportunity now to ask me some questions, but you can also email me. I do have a website that you can have a look at. And as is almost, everybody almost has to have an Instagram account. So I have one of those as well, if you'd like to have a look and also share your thoughts about today. I'd be very interested to hear any feedback that you have about this presentation. these are just, this is the team that I work with at the Royal London Hospital. This picture is a little bit old now, 2017, but we have Dr. Tony Bewley in the centre, accompanied by Dr. Ruth Taylor, and these are the two doctors who set up the Psychodermatology service at the Royal London Hospital, and supported by their junior team, including myself. We are nothing without each other, so I always like to acknowledge everyone, even though the team may look a little bit different now and may have even added a few kids. A few people in this team have completed their families now as well. And now I'd love to move on to your questions if you have any.
Thank you so much, Dr. Alia. A lot of what you said there, resonated with me. I remember my experience of being diagnosed with vitiligo by my GP at around 13 years old. And I remember in the first consultation, she was rubbing the white on my hands to see if it would come off, because she had no idea what it was. And it was maybe 2 or 3 consultations later that she picked up a huge dermatology book and said, it's vitiligo. And she said, don't worry, it's not contagious. There is no cure, and it will probably get worse. And that was how I left that appointment when I was 13. So I know the feelings of mental health struggles after trying to accept something like that. So thank you very much. I'm going to selfishly ask a question before I hand over to Natalie. To ask some from the group. So you spoke in wonderful detail about the psychological aspects post being diagnosed with a skin condition. Have you thought, or do you have any sort of insight to share on the reverse in a skin condition occurring because of things like childhood trauma, or I don't know, any great stresses or impact that would cause to the body and to the human psyche that may result in the prevalence of such skin conditions? I remember some time ago reading a book called Skin Deep by a Harvard professor called Ted Grossbar. And I remember he had a lot of theories in there around, the root cause of skin conditions, and some of it being, at least in some cases, being emotionally triggered from childhood. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, definitely. So it's very difficult to prove, but yes, when I mentioned in my talk about stress and skin conditions and how the stress axis in the brain, what it does to the body and immunity and inflammation. So there's definitely that biochemical link between emotional distress and effect on all organs. So your skin is an organ, but actually stress can affect all of them. And there's really good research that shows even cardiovascular disease being linked with stress, some of the metabolic syndromes that we see. So people who have say they're obese and they have diabetes and they have heart disease, and all of these things linked together, they don't feel like exercising, and then things get worse, and it just keeps going in this vicious cycle. So definitely I do strongly believe that, and I do tell my patients about those links. And there are more and more reports coming out, especially if you see, what's very normal on a daily basis, if I see a patient with psoriasis or eczema, and I say, do you remember when this started? So often they will say it was after there was a bereavement, or it was after I lost my job. So there's also a lot of practical information that we get from our patients. So yes, these links do exist. We may not be able to fully prove them, but we know that there's a vicious cycle once it started.
Thank you very much. Natalie, it's my pleasure to hand over to you now to relay some of the other questions.
Yes, thank you, Simon, and thank you, Dr. Alia Ahmed, for being here. Thank you. So we've got a couple of questions that have come in. So the first one is, why is there a real lack of offering psychological support services when diagnosed, as opposed to recommending treatment in the first instance? Do you see this changing, and will they be better publicised in the future?
Yeah, so the simple answer is that it's usually lack of funding. So everything always comes down to money, unfortunately, and mental health services just in general have been sort of lacking because the right funding has not always been allocated to them. And that's why reports like this one are so important, because this is what is then taken to Parliament to say, we've got evidence to say that you need to reallocate that money, and you need to reallocate it more effectively. I do see it improving. It will take time. And for example, one of the things that I believe strongly in is that every dermatology department should actually have a psychologist working in there. And this is something we're trying to champion and push forward. Again, it's always the funding that's the issue and where it comes from. Sometimes we rely on pharmaceutical companies to fund post. So I mean, it's easy to talk about treatment because, you know, we can medically prescribe that and put it on a prescription and you pay a certain charge and it's all done. But with the psychological interventions or the psychological support, it really is a little bit of a postcode lottery and what's available, which is unfortunate, but something we're trying to change.
Brilliant. Have any studies been performed into the effectiveness of mindfulness and meditation on improving the skin?
Yes, they have. So there are several studies and they have used different psychological interventions, and usually they're combined or they're cognitive behavioral interventions, and they can sometimes use more than one type of intervention. But what we know from a paper that looked sort of across the board at a number of studies, so it was a systematic review which looks at all the studies on skin disease that used a psychological intervention, and what they found was a medium-sized effect, which I think is good. So there was a positive effect. It may not have made the condition physically regress, but it definitely made people feel better, and that's the aim. Generally, if you'll feel better, then hopefully you're able to cope better with whatever skin condition you have, and you're able to achieve the things that you would want to achieve if you didn't have the skin condition.
Right. What are your 3 top tips for managing anxiety when you have a skin condition such as vitiligo?
Sure. So I talk about this a lot, and some of the simple, and I think the best thing to do is to do simple things because they're the easiest to do. So one of them, I do recommend people to do breathing exercises when they start to feel anxious. So as long as you are able to do the breathing exercise, don't have some sort of breathing condition, but I normally say, so you breathe in for 4 seconds, try and hold your breath for 7 seconds and let it out over 8 seconds. So 4, 7, 8. If you can't do it for those longer periods, you can, you know, just do the action. So breathe in, hold it and let it out slowly. So this is a good way to sort of calm your heart rate and to reduce feelings of anxiety. The other thing that I really like is positive affirmation. So having a positive dialogue with yourself that you repeat on a daily basis. So when you're doing your self-care in the morning, brushing your teeth, doing your makeup, doing your hair, whatever it is, you know, I am beautiful, I am worthy, I can deal with this day, nothing's going to affect me, I am strong. It sounds strange when you say it just like that, but when you're saying it to yourself and it means something and you design it for yourself, again, it can help to improve your mood. I also think it's important for people who are having social anxiety, especially if they're worried about someone seeing their skin when they go out, is to maybe try and engage in some simple cognitive behavioral therapy to try and turn those negative thoughts into a positive. And you can do that yourself. So if you're worried about going out because someone's going to see your hand, you know, think about, okay, they're going to see my hand. What's the worst thing that's going to happen? They're going to say, what's that? I'm going to tell them this is vitiligo. This is a skin condition. It's not contagious and I'm dealing with it. You don't need to worry about it. You know, having that thing of changing your negative perception into a positive one and knowing how to deal with it when it happens. These are just some very simple things that you can do to manage your own anxiety. Of course, if it's worse than that, then please see a healthcare professional.
Brilliant. So there is a lot of insensitivity when it comes to diagnosis, the classic line being it's vitiligo and there is no cure. This seems to be quite historic. Why do you think that is?
I think definitely I agree, and I've heard from patients how many that, you know, that this happens, and it still does. You know, it happened historically, and it still happens now, and I think this is lack of education. That's what we looked at in some of our previous research. And this is something, again, that we wanted to focus on. So really going back to a grassroots level and educating our colleagues in primary care, which is where most people will go first. You're most likely to see your GP or a practice nurse before you're likely to see someone in a dermatology department or pay privately to see a dermatologist. So I think it's mainly lack of education. And also there are lots of updates. So we've been very lucky today. We've heard some updates about what the new research is. But for example, your GP is going to see maybe 10 people with acne in one day. They'll probably see one person with vitiligo every, you know, 2 or 3 months even, or even once in a year. They're not going to keep up with that research the same way you are when you have vitiligo. So actually, what I think sometimes is even better is if you sort of make yourself confident enough to say to your GP, well, actually, yes, I agree, is vitiligo. I don't agree with the point you just made about the cure, because I know that there are treatments, there may not be a cure, and these are the guidelines I've seen. Can you please refer me? So it's really about going back to patients now and empowering patients to say, I don't agree with what you said. I respect it, but I would really like a specialist opinion, and I'm entitled to that. So just be more confident in doing, and I'm sorry that we have to tell patients to do it, but I think it's much easier that way. And we're trying to educate people as well at a grassroots level.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go over to the chat now. So Sarah has asked, when will the app for psychodermatology be available?
So we there are apps at the moment that you can use to do your own sort of treatments at home, psychological therapies at home. So like I said, mindfulness, and that's something called Headspace is a very popular app for that. Not all apps work for everyone, so you have to do a little bit of moving around with it. There's another app called Pacifica, and that helps you track your feelings of anxiety and stress. So you have to find the one that's for you. In terms of if we're developing any apps, at the moment there are several ideas flying around. Again, these are research projects that are looking at funding and trying to see if these types of things will work, or will make people feel better. And we know that there are some self-help modules available, and I think even Changing Faces website has got some information on there. So I think use the resources that are available and keep your eyes peeled for anything new.
I'd also just like to jump in there quickly and say that possibly there was a reference there to an app, the Vitiligo Society. We ran a proof of concept of a meditation app called Skin Deep, guided meditation for the skin. Mm-hmm. So we ran it with a small group of people maybe 2 years ago, and it had a guided meditation specifically for people that were dealing with skin conditions, not just vitiligo, but in the broader sense. So we had great success with that, and it is something that we're still planning to launch in the future. We're just going through basically different funding options to be able to do it. So there's a possibility that in the next couple of years that we'll release something dedicated to, the headspace, but for skin conditions. So that's something to look forward to.
Exactly. And I think targeted apps for skin conditions are lacking at the moment, and definitely there's more research going into it. So we look forward to seeing them. It just takes time.
Thank you. So John has asked, is there a link between stress and multiple skin conditions? My personal experience is that as a child, I had eczema. As a teenager, this became psoriasis, and then vitiligo as an adult.
Yes is the short answer. So we know that people with all three of these conditions do suffer from high levels of stress and anxiety, and definitely stress and anxiety can be a driver for the inflammatory conditions like eczema and psoriasis. So there is evidence to show that they can be linked, and one can lead to another. Sometimes people are on a spectrum, so even though you may have been given a diagnosis of eczema, actually it's on the same spectrum as psoriasis, so you may have been somewhere in between. So it's difficult to know if it was always just one condition, but it just started to look different as you got older as well. But definitely there are these links, yes.
So we've got a question from Sarah. What advice would you give to someone who is part of a cultural community that sees vitiligo as a bad omen or act of divine punishment?
That's a really difficult question. And there's going to be no right answer. Of course, the general advice would be that people need to be educated and, look to the resources that are available to show people. But of course, you have to think about, are those people going to engage with that? Is someone who thinks that this is some form of a punishment, are they going to engage with you saying, well, actually, the website says that it's not, are they really going to believe that? And I think sometimes this needs to go back to community leaders, and it needs to go back to a wider level audience, and they need to be called out on it. People need to be directed to correct information. And sometimes I think, unfortunately, I have to tell my patients to say, well, do you want to engage with that community anymore? Is there a way for you not to engage with them? Because you may not be able to change somebody's mind, but what can you do to make your life better? And if disengaging is the way to do that, then hopefully you'll be able to find the right support to help you. It may not work for everyone, but I think sometimes you have to walk away.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Yep, that's the end of the questions. And I'd just like to say thank you very much for all your questions that you submitted. There was a great variety. So yeah, I hope you found them very, very useful. Thank you.
Nat, there was, I think there might have been just, from one just above. Other than UV treatments and using the ointments.
Oh, okay. Yep. Sorry. Yeah, I'll just answer this one. This is from Juan. So other than UV treatment and using the ointments, what is the most important advice you give to parents with young children who have vitiligo?
So these conversations are always ones that I spend quite a long time on. So yes, to parents of children with vitiligo, I spend a lot of time educating them about the condition. And in terms of the advice that I give them, I do ask them very kindly that they should look at the positive aspects and look at the skin positivity movement, look at the people that are out there that have vitiligo, and try not to make it a difference. It is a difference, it's a visible difference, but try not to make their child feel different, and equip them with as much information as they can, as much information as the child understands, to be able to explain the condition if they need to anyone. And if that means you have to go into their school and talk to their teacher and get a representative to come along and explain what vitiligo is to the class, then fine, because I think at that age education about the condition is much more important, and normalizing it is much more important. So trying not to make your child feel different and to turn it into a positive, that's definitely something that I think is even more important than the creams. The creams may work, they may not work, but most important is to make your child feel safe and confident that there is nothing wrong with them.
Right. And also, Hannah said she would love an appointment with you. So maybe after we've finished, we can share your details with her and everybody else in the group.
Even if you just Google me, you'll find me. If you just do Dr. Ali Ahmed Dermatology, you will find me.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Natalie, thank you. You've been a trooper. Thank you for asking all the questions through the through the session. Dr. Alia, thank you so much for your input and sharing that. It was a great talk to finish on. You sort of sent us off in style, so thank you very, very much, and appreciate you just giving your time to the group. So thank you again. Okay, so I think it's about time to bring our first virtual summit to a close. As I mentioned previously, the recording of this summit, along with a survey, will be emailed out in the next few days. If we didn't get around to answering any of your questions today, please email summit@vitiligosociety.org. That's summit@vitiligosociety.org, and we'll do our best to scour John Harris's blog and speak to both Dr. V and Dr. Alia again if needs be. I'd like to thank our speakers again for the time they've given up to present and share such useful information. I'd also like to express my gratitude for everyone on the call for attending. You know, the vitiligo community, we're all in this together, and events like this really help me feel empowered. So I hope it does the same for you as well. I just want to give some special thanks to some of the trustees of the society, so my colleagues. So Denise O'Dunton has really been the project manager behind this event, and it's been, you know, it takes a lot of work to put something like this on. So I want to say a really special thank you for her hard work. Natalie, obviously, not only for asking the questions today, but she's also done a lot of marketing for the event. So thank you, Natalie. And John Dunster and Lisa Frontino are also trustees of the society and doing an immense amount of work behind the scenes. So I wanted to thank them. If you enjoyed the event and you'd like to see more of these types of services being offered, I'd ask for one last time for you to consider becoming a member of the society if you aren't already, and support our mission. We've got so many services that we provide as an organization. You know, I haven't got the time to list them all here, and I'm sure I'd miss some even if I tried. So you can sign up at join.vitiligosociety.org, and it lists the benefits that you get on there. And we've got some really exciting things planned for next year. If you are the parent of a child with vitiligo, we have a very specific service called the Parent Support Network. So if you'd like to know more about that, please get in contact and we can provide details. And I think that just almost at 9 o'clock, that's coming to an end. Enjoy what's left of your Friday, and it's been a pleasure to see you all on here. So thank you very much. Brilliant. We can call it a day there. Thank you.